Life in Tudor England meant waking up each morning under a monarchy you rarely saw but constantly felt. Like a landlord who never visits yet somehow knows exactly when you're late on rent. The king or queen wasn't just a distant figure on a coin or a name muttered in church prayers. They were the invisible architecture around your entire existence. You didn't need to meet the monarch any more than you needed to meet the wind. Both could knock you over without warning, and both had a remarkable ability to get inside your house whether you invited them or not. The crown pulsed through your day like background noise that you eventually stopped hearing, even though it dictated far more than you realized. Before we step into a world where kings and queens shaped everyday life in Tudor England, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day you're hearing this story of power unfold. Now, let's begin. Everything traced back to the sovereign. Taxes, crown, laws, crown. The rhythm of the year, the definition of loyalty, the expectation that you would behave yourself even when no one was looking. Crown. It was a system designed to feel natural, like breathing or trying not to annoy the parish constable. You accepted the crown's presence because questioning it would be as useful as shouting at the sky. The monarchy didn't operate through daily conversations or friendly reminders. It operated through assumptions you inherited before you learned to walk. You weren't taught obedience so much as marinated in it. The crown's presence showed up in the smallest rituals of life. Touching your cap when passing a noble's house, bowing at the mention of the monarch in church, offering prayers for a sovereign you would never meet, but whose health was somehow your problem. If the king had a fever, you anxiously prayed for his recovery. Not because you were particularly invested in his personal wellness, but because the last thing you needed was another religious reorganization or a new round of laws created because someone's royal dinner didn't digest properly. Even the monarch's moods could ripple outward, altering the tone of village life like a weather system with a bad temper. The crown's reach extended to your obligations as a subject. Being loyal wasn't just a moral expectation, but a daily practice. The idea of loyalty was a kind of currency, or one you were always spending whether you intended to or not. Showing obedience wasn't optional. It was part of the unwritten contract of simply existing, and this obedience seeped into the way people spoke. Conversations were shaped by caution. Jokes were shaped by survival. If you made a comment about the king, you made sure your tone suggested admiration, even if your face suggested you had indigestion. It wasn't fear that kept people in line, it was familiarity. The crown's authority wasn't merely enforced, it was normalized to the point where no one had the energy to question it. The monarch's presence didn't only reach you through laws, but through symbols, coats of arms carved into stone, royal crests painted on tavern signs, proclamations posted in marketplaces like divine instructions. The crown had an absolute talent for reminding you who was in charge without actually speaking to you. Even the church sermon wasn't safe territory. You sat through long speeches about obedience and godly order while trying not to fall asleep because the priest's loyalty to the crown was unmistakable. The divine right of kings wasn't just a religious idea. It was a psychological blanket wrapped around the entire kingdom, comforting for some, suffocating for others. But the deepest layer of royal presence wasn't symbolic. It was emotional. You lived in a world where everything felt like part of a single hierarchy, radiating outward from the crown. Your village, your parish, your family, your job. Everything was a smaller version of the system above you. Authority didn't just descend from the throne, it trickled down into every relationship. You were teaching you from childhood that obedience wasn't only expected but structurally inevitable. You didn't question why the monarch had power. You questioned why anyone would bother imagining things differently. The crown's omnipresence shaped how people imagined their own identities. A Tudor subject didn't think of themselves as separate from the monarchy. They were part of its story whether they liked it or not. You weren't an individual drifting through history. You were a thread woven into a much larger tapestry that you didn't get to design. And if that tapestry occasionally set itself on fire, well, that was above your pay grade. Your job was to admire the flames respectfully. Even your sense of safety depended on the assumption that the crown knew what it was doing. The monarchy was the anchor holding society in place, aimed preventing everything from collapsing into chaos. That's the irony. The crown's presence was both the cause of anxiety and the cure for it. You worried about pleasing the monarch because the alternative was unthinkable. In Tudor England, the crown didn't need to be physically present to control everyday life. It lived rent-free in everyone's head, and frankly, it wasn't planning to move out anytime soon. In Tudor England, the law didn't feel like a neutral set of rules created by thoughtful committees who spent weeks arguing over commas. No, the law felt like the personal mood swings of the monarch written down and enforced by people who had never met him, but were absolutely terrified of misinterpreting his intentions. You lived under a system where legality wasn't a stable landscape, it was weather. And the forecast was whatever the king or queen felt like on a particular morning. The law didn't evolve gradually through debate. It jolted into existence, fully formed, like a thunderclap from a royal cloud. One day something was tolerated, the next it was suspicious, and the next it was a punishable offence because someone in the palace decided England needed order, which usually meant everyone else needed inconvenience. Royal proclamations were the backbone of this system. They were announcements that functioned as instant law, delivered with a speed that made your head spin. A proclamation didn't require Parliament's approval, your approval, or even common sense's approval. It only required a royal signature and the confidence that every subject would fall in line. These proclamations covered everything from how markets should operate to whether certain books could be read, and they were posted in public places where you would pretend to read them while actually trying to guess which local troublemaker had inspired the newest rule. Sometimes the proclamations tried to solve specific problems, sometimes they simply reflected how the monarch felt things should be. Either way, you obeyed them. The most unsettling part was how close the law felt to the monarch's personality. If the king was anxious about rebellion, suddenly the laws were full of suspicion. If he was trying to impress foreign powers, the laws became obsessed with behaviour, respectability, and public order. If he was annoyed with the nobility, the laws became about reigning in privilege. You didn't need a political education to understand this, just a sense of patterns. The law was a diary written in legalese. It recorded the monarch's priorities, fears, frustrations and ambitions, and you experienced all of them whether you asked to or not. This personalization of law created an environment where nothing felt secure. You couldn't rely on tradition because tradition was only valid until the monarch decided it wasn't. You couldn't rely on precedent because precedent could be swept aside by a new proclamation. You couldn't rely on community interpretation because no one wanted to interpret the monarch incorrectly. So you carried a constant awareness that what was allowed today might become questionable tomorrow. It was like living in a game where the rules were rewritten mid-match. And the referee never explained the changes. He simply expected you to know. The legal system wasn't built on the idea of consistency. It was built on the idea of loyalty. Obeying the law wasn't only a civic duty, it was a performance of allegiance. Following new rules wasn't simply about compliance, it was about demonstrating that you understood where authority came from. And in this world, authority came from one individual whose decisions shaped the realm more directly than most modern governments dare to imagine. Laws didn't ask you to believe in them. They asked you to trust the monarch who made them, even when the laws felt rushed, confusing, or suspiciously targeted at a particular group of people who had angered someone in court. To make matters more interesting, enforcement of the law wasn't evenly distributed. Local officials, justices of the peace, sheriffs, parish officers, were responsible for carrying out the monarch's will, and each of them interpreted royal intent through their own biases, motivations and anxieties. If the royal proclamation was ambiguous, local officials filled in the gaps according to their understanding of what the monarch might have meant. This meant the law didn't just feel personal, it felt personal twice. Once at the top, where emotional impulses created policy, and once at the bottom, where personal interpretation shaped enforcement. You lived in a country where guessing wrong could make you a criminal. Despite this, the system worked because people grew accustomed to it. They understood that the monarch's authority was not abstract. It was embodied in the laws that shaped daily life. You didn't think of the law as a separate institution. You thought of it as the monarch's arm reaching into your village. Disobeying the law didn't feel like breaking a rule. It felt like defying the monarch personally. The idea that the crown cared what you did was both anxiety-inducing and oddly flattering. You were a speck in the kingdom, yet somehow your behaviour mattered enough to be regulated. This was the heart of Tudor legal power. Personalisation created proximity. The law wasn't distant or bureaucratic. It felt close, deliberate, pointed. It felt like someone at court had noticed your existence, which would have been charming if it weren't also terrifying. The Crown's authority radiated through every proclamation, telling you that the monarch had not merely created the law, but was watching how you followed it. The message was unmistakable. The law had a personality because the Crown had one, and you were expected to adapt to both. In Tudor England, getting dressed in the morning was never a simple matter of preference. Clothing wasn't just fabric. It was a visual resume, a walking loyalty badge, and a daily test you didn't remember agreeing to take. Every thread on your body announced your place in society, and the Crown took an intense interest in making sure those announcements were accurate. Sumptuary laws, those deeply opinionated fashion rules passed down from the monarch, were the kingdom's way of ensuring that no one accidentally appeared more important than they truly were. Dress above your rank and suddenly your shirt was treason. Well, not officially, but it certainly felt close enough to make you rethink your entire wardrobe. The idea behind these laws was simple. Everyone should look like their station. Nobles should look noble. Merchants should look modestly comfortable. Servants should look like they were definitely servants. And peasants should look like no one would ever mistake them for anything but peasants. Clothing became the first line of social surveillance. You didn't need to ask someone who they were. You just looked at their sleeves, their fabric, their buttons, their colours. It was a system where appearance wasn't fashion. It was enforcement. You wore your obedience on your body. And the Crown monitored this visual order with remarkable enthusiasm. The monarchs worried that if the lower classes dressed too richly, society would collapse into chaos. If a butcher walked around in silk, someone might mistake him for a gentleman, and then what? Would the entire kingdom dissolve into confusion? Would pigs refuse to be butchered by a man whose sleeves were too fancy? These were apparently serious concerns. The laws declared who could wear what down to the exact materials: velvet, silk, satin, fur, lace, gold thread. These weren't merely luxury choices, they were privileges. Every fabric had a price, and that price wasn't measured in coin but in hierarchy. If you were a commoner, certain fabrics were outright forbidden. Velvet, off-limits, satin, a distant dream, gold embroidery, absolutely not. You could admire these materials in paintings or on the bodies of wealthier people, but wearing them yourself was a direct challenge to the social order. The laws existed not because silk was dangerous, but because silk on the wrong person felt dangerous to the people in power. The Crown didn't just control behaviour, it controlled aesthetic imagination. Your appearance had to reassure the rest of society that you knew your place. This obsessive regulation didn't just affect what you put on your body, it affected how you thought about your aspirations. Clothing was a constant reminder that mobility was limited. Even if you earned money, even if you prospered, even if you had ambition, you couldn't dress for the life you wanted. You had to dress for the life the Crown thought you deserved. A wealthy merchant could buy fine fabrics, but he couldn't wear them without risking fines, suspicion, or public scolding. His money didn't matter. His success didn't matter. His sleeves mattered, and his sleeves said he was still not noble. Tailors had a particularly stressful role in this world. They had to keep up with trends while also avoiding illegal fashion choices that would get their clients, or themselves, into trouble. A tailor didn't just need design skills, he needed legal awareness. Making the wrong garment for the wrong person could result in punishment. Imagine sewing a beautiful velvet doublet only to realise your customer was a yeoman who legally should have been wearing wool. Suddenly your artistic achievement felt like smuggling contraband. The Crown framed these laws as moral protection. They said ostentatious clothing among the lower classes encouraged vanity, wastefulness, and social disruption. But beneath the moral language was a much more practical fear: blurred boundaries. If people could dress freely, they could potentially move through social spaces with less scrutiny. They could appear richer, more influential, more respectable than they actually were. Clothing for the Tudors was a form of identification, and the monarchy preferred clear labels. Of course, these laws were not always followed. People found ways to bend the rules, to embellish their clothing just enough to feel slightly impressive without triggering legal consequences. Smuggling foreign fabrics became a small but persistent problem. The desire to look good didn't vanish simply because the Crown wrote a proclamation. But this resistance too became part of daily life, carefully pushing boundaries while hoping no one important noticed. Breaking a sumptuary law wasn't high treason, but it was the sort of offence that demonstrated you weren't sufficiently respectful of the order of things, and that alone was dangerous enough. Yet, the strangest effect of these laws was psychological. Over time, people began to internalise them. They no longer needed to be reminded not to wear silk. They simply couldn't imagine themselves in it. Clothing shaped identity as much as identity shaped clothing. People wore wool because they believed wool was appropriate for them. The Crown didn't just regulate fashion, it regulated imagination. Your wardrobe became a physical manifestation of permission. When you walked through a Tudor marketplace, it was like looking at a colour-coded hierarchy. The wealthy shimmered in fabrics that caught the light. The poor absorbed it. The middle classes balanced practicality and aspiration, hoping to look respectable without getting fined. And through it all, the Crown's authority was visible on every body. You didn't need guards patrolling the streets to enforce order. The people enforced it on themselves every time they got dressed. In Tudor England, food was never just food. Every bite you took, every ingredient you could or couldn't afford, every aroma drifting from someone else's kitchen reminded you where you stood in the kingdom's pecking order. Meals weren't merely nourishment. They were social commentary served on wooden trenchers and pewter plates. Dinner didn't fill you up. It reminded you weren't important. Your place in society shaped your diet more than your appetite ever could. If you were wealthy or noble, your table looked like a parade of abundance. Roasted meats, pies stuffed with anything that could fit inside pastry, exotic spices that travelled farther than you ever would, and sugar, mountains of sugar, because nothing said status like eating something that cost more than your neighbour's annual income. Luxuries didn't just taste good, they announced your significance. A noble feast wasn't a meal, it was a spectacle designed to confirm that the household mattered. The more extravagant the spread, the safer the status. Meanwhile, if you were poor, meaning most people, your daily meals circled around the same few ingredients, with the creativity of someone desperately trying to convince themselves that porridge again was perfectly fine. Bread, ale, pottage, maybe some cheese if the stars aligned, and occasionally a bit of fish or bacon so small it should have been called a rumour of meat. Vegetables were common, but no one wrote poetry about them. Your meals weren't about flavour or enjoyment. No, they were about survival and moderation, two things that the wealthy philosophised about ironically while chewing on roasted swan. And it wasn't simply that different classes ate different foods, it was that they were expected to eat according to their station. Rich foods, the Crown believed, would disrupt the natural order if consumed by the poor. This wasn't just class bias, it was policy. The Crown supported restrictions that limited access to certain foods by price, availability, and custom. Meat was associated with status, strength, and prosperity. Too much of it on a commoner's plate made authorities uneasy. After all, well-fed peasants might become energetic, and energetic peasants might start asking questions. Food also acted as a form of storytelling. When a noble threw a feast, it wasn't just to satisfy hunger, it was a political performance. You weren't simply offering food, you were offering proof that you were powerful enough to waste it. Tables groaned under the weight of excessive dishes, not because anyone planned to eat them all, but because abundance equaled influence. A Tudor feast was a message written in gravy and spice. Look at how much I can afford to have left over. And then there was fasting, which ironically revealed just as much about status as feasting. Religious fasting days were mandatory, but the wealthy observed them more comfortably. When forbidden from eating meat, they simply switched to expensive fish, or elaborate vegetarian dishes that somehow managed to contradict the entire purpose of fasting. The poor, on the other hand, simply continued eating their usual meals, which were already so plain they counted as spiritual discipline without trying. Fasting wasn't a shared experience, it was a mirror held up to inequality. For the average Tudor household, food insecurity was a constant presence. Bad harvest, prices soared, harsh winter, bread shrank. When grain was scarce, the crown stepped in, not to distribute food, but to regulate prices and prevent hoarding. Officially, this was for the common good. Unofficially, it was because hungry crowds became angry crowds, and angry crowds were inconvenient for people sitting on thrones. But even in these interventions, class dictated the outcome. The wealthy weathered shortages with stored supplies and imported luxuries. The poor weathered shortages by hoping they survived. The symbolism extended into the rules about who could serve certain foods. There were guidelines about what different social ranks could present at their tables, particularly when hosting guests. Offering a dish above your station wasn't seen as generosity, it was seen as presumption. If you were a small household presenting extravagant dishes, you weren't being ambitious, you were being suspicious. A meal that looked too noble raised eyebrows. It made people wonder if you were pretending to be more important than you were, or worse, trying to attract loyalty you weren't entitled to. But perhaps the most telling part of Tudor food culture was how loudly meals spoke about order. Every social gathering revolved around tables where seating, serving, and even the placement of dishes reflected hierarchy. The highest-ranking guests ate the best cuts, served first, in view of everyone else. Lower-ranking diners received simpler fare and discovered that sitting farther from the host correlated strongly with eating food that tasted increasingly like disappointment. Even in celebration, the system reminded you where you belonged. The crown did not need to send officials into your kitchen to enforce this structure. The restrictions and expectations were embedded into lifestyle itself. You learned from childhood what you were meant to eat, what you could afford, and what you must never aspire to taste. Your diet became a ritual of acknowledgement, a culinary nod to the fact that the world was not equal. Everyone ate, but not everyone dined. In the end, food in Tudor England was less about sustenance and more about identity. Every bowl, every loaf, every feast or famine reflected the structure of society, where eating wasn't a private act. It was a reinforcement of your place in the great ladder of existence, rung by edible rung. Time in Tudor England wasn't something you personally managed. It wasn't a neutral backdrop to your day, and it certainly wasn't a flexible concept you could negotiate with. Time belonged to the crown. Your day ran on royal-approved schedules, and you didn't check the clock to see whether it suited you, because you didn't have a clock. Instead, the time checked you. Bells, curfews, church hours, and work rhythms structured life so completely that you moved through the day not by choice but by choreography, a routine arranged long before you woke up and continuing long after you fell asleep. The most powerful instrument of this timekeeping wasn't a device but a sound, the church bell. Bells told you everything: when to wake, when to work, when to pray, when to stop, and when to gather. They rang out from towers like the kingdom's heartbeat, and you followed their rhythm because everyone else did. The bells weren't owned by the crown, but the authority behind them was unmistakably tied to royal expectations. Time was communal. If the bell rang and you didn't move, people noticed. Time didn't belong to you. It belonged to the system that decided how England should function. The crown maintained order partly by shaping when things happened. Curfews were a clear example. As night fell, towns marked the transition with bells that signalled it was time to put out fires, shut doors, and retreat indoors. After dark, wandering the streets wasn't simply unsafe, It was suspect. A person out past curfew looked like someone with bad intentions or questionable judgment, and neither was good for your health in an era where suspicion travelled faster than you could run. The curfew bell didn't ask whether you were finished with your tasks, it instructed you. Time obeyed the crown, so you obeyed time. Work rhythms also revolved around these structured hours. For labourers, the workday was calibrated by light and bells, not personal energy. You worked at sunrise because that's when the world expected labour to begin. You paused not because you felt tired, but because the bell said you should. Meals were slotted into the day at specific intervals, and even leisure happened in small pockets shaped by necessity, not desire. A Tudor villager didn't talk about free time. Free time wasn't free. It was rationed by daylight and obligations. The idea of time as something you owned would have sounded absurd, like owning the weather or owning silence. Those things belonged to higher powers. Religious calendars added another layer of structure, weaving the sacred into the daily rhythm. Dozens of feast days, fast days, saints' days, and holy obligations carved the year into segments that determined when you worked and when you rested. These weren't suggestions. They were mandatory expectations that aligned your schedule with the kingdom's moral universe. The crown's promotion of religious conformity meant these calendars weren't just spiritual. They were political. Holidays marked loyalty. Attendance marked obedience. Time, once again, became a measure of allegiance. Seasonal rhythms mattered just as much. Tudor time was elastic, expanding in summer and shrinking in winter. Long daylight meant long work days. Short daylight meant urgency. Farmers lived by the agricultural calendar, which the crown supported through regulations, taxes, and expectations. You didn't decide when to plant or harvest. The year decided for you, and if harvest failed, the consequences rippled outward into legal, economic, and social pressures imposed by authorities trying to keep the kingdom stable. Travel also operated on strict temporal boundaries. Roads were unsafe after dark, inns expected arrivals before nightfall, and local officials treated travellers with suspicion if they appeared at odd hours. Moving through England was as much about timing as distance. If you left too late, you risked being stranded in a village that didn't trust strangers. And time wasn't just a schedule, it was a filter that separated safe behaviour from suspicious behaviour. Even the courts ran on royal time. Legal matters were handled during specific sessions, and failing to appear wasn't merely inconvenient. It could derail your life. Officials operated on timetables dictated by the Crown's administrative machinery, meaning your personal emergencies were irrelevant. You adjusted to their schedule, not the other way around. Missing a court date was treated less like a mistake and more like disrespect, because in a way, it was. The monarchy's influence extended into how people thought about time. It wasn't conceptual or philosophical, it was practical and imposed. Life felt like a series of external commands disguised as natural rhythms. Bells weren't just signals. They were reminders that you lived within a hierarchy where punctuality equaled obedience. If the bell told you to pray, you prayed. If the calendar told you to fast, you fasted. If the curfew told you to sleep, you slept, or at least pretended to, which was often good enough for avoiding trouble. The most revealing part of Tudor timekeeping was that no one questioned it. People accepted that time flowed through them, rather than from them. There was a sense of inevitability, a belief that the structure of the day existed because it was supposed to. Time wasn't yours to shape. It was another expression of authority, quiet, consistent, and deeply embedded into how society understood order. In the end, Tudor time didn't tick by in minutes or seconds. It moved in bells, seasons, prayers, and commands. Time was a shared experience. But it wasn't shared equally. The Crown didn't need to stand over you to control your day. It simply needed to control the schedule, and the schedule controlled you. Your life unfolded hour by hour in a timetable built by people you would never meet, shaped by forces you couldn't see, and upheld by expectations you learned before you understood them. Religion in Tudor England wasn't simply a personal belief or a comforting weekly ritual. It was a mandatory performance of loyalty, a public demonstration that you understood your place in the grand hierarchy of God, king and kingdom, usually in that order, though sometimes it was hard to tell which authority outranked the other. Faith doubled as obedience, and obedience doubled as survival. Miss church and suddenly God wasn't the one judging you. Every Tudor subject, regardless of enthusiasm, was expected to show up at church every Sunday and on holy days. Attendance wasn't optional, and it certainly wasn't private. Church wardens kept meticulous records of who arrived, who stayed home, and who mysteriously needed to tend to the cows every time a sermon ran longer than expected. Your absence didn't suggest spiritual fatigue, it suggested rebellion. Being seen in church was as important as anything you heard there. It told the community, and by extension the crown, that you were participating in the shared religious identity that held the kingdom together. The Tudor monarchs understood how valuable religion was as a tool for social order. After all, nothing binds people like a shared belief system, especially one backed by law. The monarch wasn't just the head of the political structure. Thanks to the Reformation, they were the head of the church as well. This meant that attending services wasn't just about honouring God, it was about honouring the crown's chosen version of God. The difference between the two could shift depending on which monarch sat on the throne, and the unpredictability added a delightful sense of spiritual jeopardy to daily life. Church services served as weekly reminders of what the crown expected from its subjects. Sermons emphasised obedience, loyalty, charity, especially when monitored, and acceptance of the social order. Priests acted as both spiritual guides and community supervisors, relaying royal expectations through a religious lens. When the priest spoke about following authority, no one needed clarification about which authority he meant. The walls of the church may have been decorated with saints, but the atmosphere carried the invisible presence of the monarchy. Religious conformity wasn't only enforced in church, it seeped into everyday behaviours. The prayers you recited, the holidays you observed, the language you used when talking about God, all had to align with the official doctrine. Deviating from the approved formula marked you as someone with questionable loyalties, and questionable loyalties led quickly to uncomfortable conversations with local officials who were far more interested in your political reliability than your spiritual well-being. Faith, in this world, wasn't a sanctuary, it was a public exam. Religious calendars also dictated the rhythm of life. You went to church when the calendar said so, fasted when it said so, rested when it said so. You didn't choose spiritual practices the way modern people browse a menu of options. Your religious obligations were pre-arranged, and everyone had the same schedule. The crown didn't need to peek into your home to know what you were supposed to be doing, the calendar told them. And if your behaviour didn't match the expected pattern, the community noticed, because everyone knew what everyone was supposed to be doing at any given moment. Confession wasn't a typical Tudor practice in the Protestant era, but the idea of scrutiny persisted. People watched one another for signs of improper devotion, not because they were naturally suspicious, but because religious conformity was tied to the safety of the entire village. One person's deviation could draw unwanted attention. If you skipped church, someone might worry that your absence would reflect poorly on the entire community, or worse, attract the attention of officials who would assume the village wasn't properly aligned with the crown's religious vision. It wasn't paranoia, it was pragmatism. The crown leveraged this environment skillfully. Religion became a subtle enforcement system that didn't require constant royal oversight because the community handled the surveillance. People policed themselves and one another out of habit and fear. You didn't need guards stationed at the church doors. Social expectation did the work far more efficiently. It's difficult to imagine a more effective method of ensuring compliance than convincing people that obedience to the crown and obedience to God were the same thing. This blending of spiritual and political identity created a peculiar kind of pressure. You weren't simply trying to be a good Christian, you were trying to be a good subject. The two roles fused so tightly that failing one meant failing both. If you questioned the authorized beliefs, even privately, you risked being seen as a threat to stability. The monarch's religious reforms, sometimes dramatic, sometimes contradictory, filtered down into villages where people adapted not out of philosophical conviction, but out of sheer necessity. A shift in royal preference meant a shift in doctrine, and your own beliefs needed to keep pace unless you enjoyed unnecessary risk. Even the music in church played a part. Hymns were chosen not only for theological meaning but for their alignment with royal ideology. When the congregation sang, they weren't just harmonizing, they were participating in a public reaffirmation of the monarchy's authority. Sitting silently was conspicuous. Singing loudly was encouraged, but not too loudly, or people might think you were showing off. Religion required not just participation, but calibrated participation. The psychological effect of all this was unmistakable. Over time, people internalized the idea that faith was something performed under watchful eyes. Spiritual routines became part of social identity, reinforcing belonging through repetition. Church attendance wasn't merely an obligation, it was a ritual of public reassurance, a weekly declaration that you were still part of the realm, still aligned, still correct. Religion, in Tudor life, was less about personal salvation and more about collective stability. Faith didn't only shape your soul, it shaped your reputation. Showing up on Sunday didn't prove you believed, it proved you obeyed. And in a kingdom where belonging was survival, obedience was everything. In Tudor England, speech wasn't just communication, it was a liability. Words carried weight, and the wrong ones could drop on you like a hammer. Free speech existed, technically, but it just ended your life. In a world where the monarch's authority sat at the centre of everything, saying the wrong thing wasn't a minor slip, it was a potential invitation to disaster. Talking was dangerous, and silence was a skill people learned the way others learned to fish or sew. Your tongue wasn't just part of your body, it was a weapon you were expected never to use. Treason laws cast an enormous shadow over daily conversation. You didn't have to plot against the crown or conspire with enemies to get in trouble. You simply had to talk. The law treated words as actions, and sometimes as worse than actions. If you spoke ill of the monarch, drunkenly, jokingly, accidentally, the crown didn't care about your mood. The only acceptable explanation was you didn't say it. Rumours that criticised the king weren't considered harmless gossip. They were threats to stability. If spoken loudly enough, they transformed the speaker into a criminal. Treason came in many forms, but the verbal variety was especially terrifying because anyone could commit it without meaning to. People became masters of self-monitoring. Speech required caution, calculation, and the constant awareness that anyone who overheard you might interpret your words incorrectly, or correctly, which was worse. You learned to edit yourself mid-sentence, to soften opinions, to end conversations early, to nod along when others spoke. Every Tudor subject had a rich internal life and a very cautious external one. The line between thinking and speaking was policed by fear, not grammar. Rumour culture made everything even more precarious. The Tudor kingdom thrived on gossip, not because people enjoyed trouble, though some certainly did, but because information travelled faster by whispers than by proclamations. But rumours were double-edged. Sharing one might demonstrate boldness or wit, but it might also reveal disloyalty. And you never truly knew who was listening. A neighbour could report you. A stranger in the tavern might remember your words. Even a family member could unintentionally repeat something you'd said in confidence. Words were slippery, are unpredictable, and prone to wandering. The Crown capitalised on this environment, encouraging informants and rewarding those who reported suspicious speech. It turned listening into a civic duty. People didn't just speak carefully, they listened carefully, waiting for signs of dissent. A poorly phrased joke could become tomorrow's accusation. A sarcastic comment about royal taxes could be interpreted as sedition. Even harmless complaints could be misheard, misquoted or misused by someone eager to appear loyal at your expense. Taverns were especially risky. Alcohol loosened tongues faster than common sense could tighten them. A room full of people drinking ale and sharing opinions was a recipe for disaster, especially when tempers or self-restraint slipped. Many treason accusations began with words spoken over a mug. The tavern keeper might overhear you. The stranger next to you might be more sober than you assumed. You could curse the price of bread or complain about a local official without consequence. But if your sentence drifted dangerously close to mentioning the monarch in any tone less than admiration, the entire room seemed to freeze. The danger wasn't just vertical, between commoners and the crown, it was horizontal. People policed one another. Reputations were delicate, and aligning yourself with someone who said questionable things could damage your standing. You didn't just avoid speaking treasonously, you avoided being around treasonous speech. If someone started a conversation with, "Between you and me," you knew it was time to leave immediately and pretend you had urgent business involving water fetching, child minding, or staring at a wall. Even in private, speech carried risk. Households weren't soundproof, and walls had a talent for leaking information. Children repeated things innocently. Servants heard things accidentally. Neighbours overheard through thin timber and plaster. A dangerous opinion murmured inside your home could easily travel outside it. You didn't need to declare anything loudly to be heard. In many cases, people whispered more out of instinct than necessity. Whispering felt safer. It made you feel like the world shrank to the size of your own breath. The crown didn't need modern surveillance. Tudor society policed itself because the danger of a loose speech was so ingrained that people internalized the rules. They taught their children caution the way others taught table manners. Think before you speak wasn't a proverb. It was a survival strategy. The power of speech meant that people became experts at talking in circles, implying instead of stating, shifting blame back to a man someone heard somewhere, or simply shrugging dramatically when asked for an opinion. The safest opinion was no opinion at all. Despite the fear, people still talked. Humans are social creatures. Whisper networks flourished, encoded with humour, double meanings and exaggerated caution. People developed a talent for speaking around things instead of about them. A well-placed eyebrow could communicate more truth than a paragraph. The subtleties of Tudor communication weren't born from elegance. They were born from necessity. People learned how to communicate without incriminating themselves, turning small talk into an art form that required as much skill as any craft. The psychological impact of this environment was immense. Over time, people didn't just fear treasonous speech, they feared spontaneous speech. Words became something you handled carefully, like a blade. You used them precisely. You sheathed them when not needed. You kept them sharp, but out of sight. You learned to speak with the awareness that every sentence carried weight, and that the crown's shadow stretched into every conversation, every room, every pause. In Tudor England, words were powerful enough to build reputations or destroy lives. Talking wasn't about expression. It was about survival, and silence, in a strange way, became the most eloquent form of loyalty. Marriage in Tudor England wasn't a romantic milestone or a celebration of affection. It was more like a contract witnessed by God, neighbours, and the ever-present shadow of the crown. You didn't marry for happiness. You married for permission. Love was optional, pleasant if it appeared, but not required. What truly mattered was that your marriage fit neatly into the structure the monarchy tried so hard to maintain. A world where inheritance was predictable, property flowed in expected directions, and social order remained undisturbed. The crown had a vested interest in marriage because marriage determined the shape of society. It decided who inherited land, who controlled wealth, and who produced the next generation of subjects. In a world where lineage shaped influence, the state saw marriage less as private union and more as a mechanism for stability, or, in noble families, political manoeuvring. A marriage wasn't two people joining together, it was two families becoming strategically entangled. And whether you were a peasant or a lord, The crown's expectations hovered behind your vows like an uninvited chaperone. For noble families, marriage was explicitly political. Alliances were built, debts resolved, land consolidated, and connections strengthened through strategic matches. A well-arranged union could transform a family's fortune. A poorly arranged one could destroy it. Even the monarch paid close attention, sometimes intervening when they believed a marriage might shift the balance of power too far in anyone else's favour. Permission wasn't just a formality. It was a checkpoint. If the crown suspected a union might produce too much influence in a rival's hands, objections appeared swiftly. But the lower classes weren't free from oversight either. While their marriages didn't shift national politics, they affected local ones. Parish authorities tracked marriage announcements with the same diligence they tracked births and deaths. Couples needed to follow proper procedures. Banns announced publicly 3 times. No prior contracts with others. No suspiciously spontaneous unions. This wasn't for romance. It was to prevent disputes about property, legitimacy, and obligations. A community needed clear lines. Who owned what, and who was responsible for supporting whom. Marriage organised these lines. A significant reason the crown cared so much was inheritance. Land was the backbone of Tudor wealth, and controlling its transfer maintained social order. Marriage created legitimate heirs, and legitimate heirs meant fewer disputes. Illegitimacy wasn't just a family issue, it was a legal and economic one. A child born outside marriage disrupted property lines and threatened the careful balance of who owned what. The state disliked uncertainty, and nothing created uncertainty faster than unclear paternity. Marriage, therefore, became the official way to keep track of who belonged to whom and who owed what to the next generation. Even affection was treated suspiciously if it disrupted these patterns. Marrying purely for love, rare but not unheard of, raised eyebrows if it defied expectations. If a young woman chose a poor but charming neighbour over a more advantageous match, the village might whisper, not because they begrudged romance, but because the economic implications mattered. A marriage wasn't about personal fulfilment. It was about resources, labour, and future dependence. The crown didn't regulate emotions, but it regulated outcomes. For women especially, marriage shaped their entire legal existence. A woman's identity was absorbed into her husband's, her property transferred to him, and her obligations became extensions of his. Marriage clarified responsibilities in the eyes of the crown, who paid fines, who owed taxes, who maintained property, who produced heirs. This wasn't oppression for oppression's sake. It was bureaucratic logic. The state needed someone to hold accountable, and marriage provided that structure. It turned 2 individuals into one responsible unit. And then there were the marriages the crown directly manipulated. Noble unions arranged to secure loyalty, reward service, or prevent rebellion. The monarch had the power to influence, or approve, or forbid marriages among the elite. Henry VIII perfected this as if it were a personal hobby. Some unions elevated families, others conveniently weakened them. Marriage became a game board, with the crown moving pieces wherever it pleased. To marry without royal approval, particularly if it involved individuals of rank, could be interpreted as an act of defiance. On the other end of the spectrum, ordinary people negotiated marriage with pragmatic calculations. Families considered dowries, work potential, land access, and community standing. Love could blossom, but it usually had to negotiate with reality first. You didn't ask, will this person make me happy? You asked, will this person help us survive? Happiness was a pleasant side effect if it happened. Stability came first. Marriage also served as a moral checkpoint. It offered legitimacy not just to children but to behaviour. Living together outside marriage was frowned upon and could lead to fines or public shaming. Adultery, too, was treated as a social threat. The crown didn't care about romantic betrayal. It cared about inheritance chaos. The law wasn't protecting feelings. It was protecting property structures. Weddings themselves, surprisingly, were modest affairs for many. The real significance wasn't the celebration, but the contract behind it. Once the vows were spoken and recorded, the legal transformation occurred. Two people became one economic unit, one lineage, one future. It was less a celebration of union and more a declaration of responsibility, public, binding, and overseen by church and state. In this world, marriage wasn't a personal journey, but a public function. Nay, the crown didn't need to be present at your wedding to influence it. The entire system was built around the assumption that marriage existed for the good of the realm first, and for the individual second. The stability of England depended on these private contracts functioning smoothly, predictably, and obediently. Love might make the songs and the stories, but inheritance made the laws, and the laws won every time. Childhood in Tudor England wasn't a gentle period of discovery, imagination, or limitless potential. It was a practical stage, designed with the same efficiency as a workshop. You weren't raised, you were processed. Children were not seen primarily as individuals with dreams or feelings. They were future labour, future taxpayers, future subjects whose value lay in how they would eventually contribute to the kingdom. The crown didn't need to directly manage every child. The structure of society did that automatically, shaping childhood into an early apprenticeship in obedience, productivity, and survival. From the moment a child could stand steadily, expectations began to settle on their shoulders. Childhood was a brief window, and no one wasted time pretending it was longer or lighter than it truly was. Life demanded hands, small ones, nimble ones, quick ones. Whether in fields, workshops, or kitchens, children became participants in the household economy by necessity. They fetched water, gathered firewood, tended animals, cleaned tools, minded younger siblings, ran errands, and performed whatever tasks fit their size and tolerance for boredom. The idea of a child helping out wasn't an act of parental encouragement. It was an essential component of keeping the family alive. Education, when it existed, followed the same practical logic. Formal schooling was rare and usually reserved for those whose families could afford to spare them from labour. But even then, education wasn't about personal enrichment. It was about shaping the child into a functioning cog in a social machine. Grammar schools taught Latin not because it was intellectually beautiful, but because it trained minds for clerical or administrative roles that served the crown. Reading and writing weren't expressions of creativity. They were gateways into usefulness. The curriculum trained obedience through structure, repetition, and the expectation that knowledge would be used in service to authority, not in questioning it. For many children, however, apprenticeship was the real education. Apprenticeships weren't simply job training. They were agreements that passed children from one household structure to another, where they would spend years learning a craft under the authority of a master. These arrangements were tightly regulated by guilds and local officials, because apprentices were part of the economic foundation the crown relied upon. Their work secured stable production, predictable labour, and well-defined career paths. An apprentice's life was strict: long hours, little privacy, limited freedom, and constant oversight. It wasn't unusual for an apprentice to enter a master's home as a child and leave as an adult with a profession, a sense of discipline, and a lifelong understanding that authority was something you yielded to, not challenged. Even play reflected the expectations of future roles. Children's games weren't whimsical explorations. They mimicked adult work. Boys played at ploughing, trading, or fighting. Girls practiced domestic tasks, using makeshift tools to rehearse the chores that would dominate their futures. Childhood imagination wasn't discouraged, but it was shaped. You could pretend to be many things, so long as your pretending led you toward the life your family and the crown assumed you would live. Responsibility came early, and consequences came early too. The law treated children with far less leniency than modern people imagine. A child old enough to work was old enough to be held accountable. Crimes committed by children could lead to harsh punishments because disorder, at any age, was a threat to stability. Misbehaviour wasn't framed as youthful mischief. It was seen as a failure of upbringing, a weakness in household authority, and a potential future problem for the community. Children were evaluated not for who they were, but for who they were becoming. Families understood these pressures intimately. A child wasn't just a beloved member of the household. They were a resource. Their future labour mattered. Their future marriage prospects mattered. Their future loyalty mattered. A well-trained child meant stability. A poorly trained one meant uncertainty. And uncertainty was a luxury few households could afford. Parents instilled discipline not because they were cruel, but because they were raising children in a world where softness could cripple a family's chances of survival. Religious expectations reinforced this utilitarian approach. Children were taught early to fear sin, respect authority, and accept the hierarchy of the world they lived in. They memorized prayers, attended services, and absorbed the idea that obedience wasn't simply expected, it was virtuous. Faith shaped their behavior, but it also shaped their roles. Children weren't encouraged to ask questions. They were encouraged to listen, to accept, to fit in. This formed the foundation of their adult lives long before they reached adulthood. The Crown rarely needed to intervene directly in childhood because the system surrounding children already served its interests beautifully. Yet every part of early life pushed children toward practicality, conformity, and readiness. When they grew old enough to join the workforce, contribute to the household, or enter formal apprenticeships, they did so seamlessly because that was what childhood had prepared them for. And when they swore loyalty, paid taxes, or served in local duties, they did so as people shaped from infancy to accept that their lives were woven into a larger, immovable structure. Childhood in Tudor England was not sentimental. It was functional. A child was a future adult moulded for the needs of the realm. By the time they reached maturity, they understood where they stood, what they owed, and how the world worked. Not because they'd been taught philosophy, but because they'd been shaped by necessity. And even their earliest memories belonged as much to the Crown as to their family. Children weren't raised, they were prepared. In Tudor England, your home may have had walls, but those walls were more symbolic than functional. Privacy was suspicious, and loyalty tests ignored them. The idea of a private domestic life sealed off from outsiders simply didn't exist. A Tudor house was less a sanctuary and more a performance stage, where neighbours, officials, church wardens, and the occasional informant wandered in and out of your business with the confidence of people checking on livestock. Home wasn't where you escaped authority. It was where authority checked on you with surprising enthusiasm. Inspections were normal, expected, and woven into the rhythm of community life. Officials had the right to enter your home for a variety of reasons. To check if you kept the peace, if you maintained proper household order, or if the Crown's expectations were being met under your roof. Poor law overseers inspected homes to determine eligibility for relief. Church wardens visited to enforce religious duties. Constables arrived to investigate anything remotely questionable. None of this was considered intrusive. It was simply the system functioning as intended. A Tudor house was not your kingdom. It was an outpost of the Crown. These inspections weren't always official. Often the most persistent visitors were neighbours whose curiosity doubled as community vigilance. Gossip was a form of surveillance. People watched one another not out of malice, but because everyone shared responsibility for maintaining order. If you were loud late at night, someone noticed. If you had unexpected visitors, someone noticed. If you closed your shutters a little too often, people wondered what you were hiding. And if someone wondered, the entire community would soon have opinions. Your home existed within a living network of eyes and ears, and none of them believed in minding their own business. The state took advantage of this communal attention. It didn't need an army of inspectors because it had a population trained by culture and necessity to enforce expectations. Informants were everywhere. Neighbours with grudges, acquaintances seeking favour, even friends who thought reporting you was the responsible thing to do. People didn't imagine themselves as spies. They imagined themselves as protectors of their community's stability. Reporting suspicious behaviour wasn't betrayal, it was civic duty. Suspicion wasn't limited to dramatic offences, it applied to everyday habits. If you kept your doors closed too tightly, someone might whisper that you were hiding religious materials or harbouring strangers. If your household seemed unusually wealthy or unusually poor, questions followed. If someone spotted you burning papers, rumours grew wings. Privacy felt less like a right, and more like an invitation for speculation. A household that tried too hard to keep its affairs hidden looked like it had something to hide, and Tudor England loved nothing more than unravelling mysteries, especially the mundane ones. Even the layout of Tudor homes resisted privacy. Rooms flowed into one another without clear boundaries, and families shared spaces constantly. Servants slept near their tasks, not behind closed doors. Children wandered freely between rooms. Visitors entered without ceremony. Doors existed, but they were rarely locked. The idea of a private bedroom or private study belonged to the extremely wealthy or the fantastically imaginative. Most people lived in spaces where every movement was witnessed, every conversation overheard, and every decision open to comment. Domestic order, too, was monitored by the community. A household that ran smoothly signalled obedience, discipline, and economic stability. A household that looked chaotic suggested moral or social disorder. If your children seemed unruly, if your spouse seemed unhappy, if your home looked unkept, people didn't just gossip, they worried. Disorder hinted at deeper issues that might ripple outward. Conflict, poverty, indecent, irresponsibility. A home was expected to function as a miniature version of the kingdom, structured, predictable, and publicly upright. This expectation extended to religious behaviour inside the home. While Chapter 6 explored the public requirements of faith, within the household those expectations lived on. People noticed who prayed regularly, who displayed religious symbols, who followed the calendar through domestic routines. Neglecting these practices signalled not just spiritual negligence, but potential political unreliability. Your neighbours didn't need proof to become suspicious. They only needed a feeling. Household inventories added another layer of intrusion. When someone died or transferred property, officials recorded possessions in meticulous lists. These inventories reveal how deeply the state cared about controlling assets, wealth distribution, and inheritance. But they also show how thoroughly homes were examined. Every pot, garment, and tool might be listed, evaluated, and judged. The privacy of grief, property, or personal belongings was never an option. The home existed under constant administrative scrutiny. Domestic life itself became a public indicator of loyalty. Hospitality mattered. Too much hospitality might appear suspicious, but too little looked unfriendly and uncooperative. Hosting community gatherings was expected. Refusing them raised questions. Celebrations, mourning rituals, work routines, and even how often your family appeared outdoors all functioned as signals. You lived not just in the community but under it, and in moments of crisis, plague, famine, a crime, the intrusion intensified. Officials inspected homes for sanitation, illness, hoarded goods, or strangers. Quarantine wasn't a polite request, it was an enforced reality. Entire houses could be sealed, front doors were marked, people inside were monitored. In emergencies, the home became even less your own. The psychological impact of this environment shaped how people thought, behaved, and organised their lives. Privacy wasn't expected, so it wasn't missed. People internalised the idea that being seen was the natural state of life. The walls of a Tudor home weren't barriers, they were permeable boundaries, offering shelter but never seclusion. Every action was taken with the understanding that it might be witnessed, interpreted, and judged. Homes were not private. They were public extensions of the community and, by proxy, the crown. In Tudor England, loyalty wasn't performed only in public squares or at church. It was performed in kitchens, in shared rooms, in the daily rhythm of domestic life. Your home wasn't your refuge. It was your stage, and the audience never left. Justice in Tudor England wasn't designed to comfort, rehabilitate, or quietly correct wrongdoing. It was designed to terrify. Fear was the point. Punishment wasn't a private legal matter. It was a public performance, a spectacle crafted to keep everyone else obedient. The execution wasn't for the criminal, it was for you. It was a warning carved into the air, a message written in real time on a stage no one wanted to stand on. Courts handled crimes, but punishment belonged to the streets, the squares, the marketplaces, places where crowds gathered naturally, where news spread quickly, where people could witness the consequences of stepping outside the boundaries set by the crown. Executions became events, grim assemblies where the community came together not out of curiosity alone, but because attendance felt like civic obligation. Seeing the punishment helped reinforce the lesson, and not seeing it meant risking being seen as someone who didn't take loyalty seriously enough. The spectacle began long before the executioner raised a blade or prepared a rope. Rumours circulated, gathering details, exaggerations, moral judgments. People discussed what the accused had done, whether they deserved it, and how their fate would reflect on everyone else. By the time the prisoner reached the scaffold, their story had already been absorbed into the collective imagination. The community didn't simply witness justice, they participated in it emotionally, sometimes loudly, sometimes uneasily, sometimes with the detached curiosity of people watching a play they couldn't leave. The journey to execution was itself part of the ritual. Prisoners were paraded through streets under guard, the route chosen for maximum visibility. People watched from windows, from doorways, from rooftops. Children, who were rarely shielded from such events, absorbed the message early. The law wasn't distant. It was a force that had arms, legs, footsteps, and consequences. The spectacle didn't only punish the condemned, it trained the spectators. Traitors faced the most elaborate punishments, reserved for those who threatened the crown's authority. These rituals were meant to imprint fear so deeply that the very idea of disloyalty felt unthinkable. The full ceremony, grisly, extended and choreographed, was designed to be unforgettable. No one watching needed a written law book after seeing such a display. They understood perfectly. The crown didn't simply punish dissent, it displayed the cost of it. Other offences led to less dramatic but still highly public consequences. Stocks and pillories were staples of Tudor justice, located in central areas where humiliation could do its work efficiently. Theft, fraud, slander, each had punishments tailored for visibility. People were immobilised while neighbours, acquaintances and complete strangers stared, commented or occasionally threw things. The punishment wasn't pain, it was exposure. You didn't just suffer. You served as a living billboard for obedience. Whippings followed similar patterns. They were carried out in public places, and the sound carried far, sharper than a sermon and far more memorable. Even minor offences could lead to such punishments, reinforcing the idea that the margin for error in Tudor life was thin. The point wasn't to create better people. The point was to create cautious ones. When the crack of a whip entered someone's memory, it stayed there as a boundary marker. The theatrical quality of Tudor justice extended to the roles people played. The executioner was both feared and necessary, a figure who stood between order and chaos. Crowds watched him not only for what he would do, but for how well he did it. A clean strike of the axe reassured people of efficiency. A botched one horrified them, and made the message even stronger. The condemned sometimes spoke from the scaffold, offering confessions or warnings, their final words becoming part of the performance. Even in death they reinforced the system. Authorities understood the psychological power of these displays. Punishment didn't need to be frequent to be effective, it needed to be unforgettable. A single execution could keep a village obedient for years. A single dramatic punishment could spread across towns by word of mouth, reaching people who had never seen it, but felt its weight anyway. Fear travelled faster than messengers, but the most unsettling truth was that people accepted these spectacles as natural. They didn't question their purpose because they grew up with them. Children saw them. Adults expected them. The emotional shock softened into cultural habit. Justice wasn't something that happened in courtrooms or behind walls. It happened in the open, where the entire population could learn from the mistakes of others without making any themselves. The public nature of punishment also reinforced community norms. People judged not only the criminals, but each other's reactions. Showing too much sympathy for the condemned might raise questions. Showing too much enthusiasm might also. Proper behaviour during punishment was itself a demonstration of loyalty. Even standing in the crowd required a certain performance of correctness. Inside homes, people spoke cautiously afterward, replaying the details with the awareness that someone might be listening. The spectacle lingered. Parents used it as a tool to teach children. Adults used it as a reminder to themselves. Fear sat like a silent guest in every conversation about the law, the crown, or authority. The message was clear. The state didn't simply enforce obedience, it curated it. Punishment served as anchors in the community's memory. Everyone remembered where they were during the last execution. Everyone remembered who stood near the scaffold. Everyone remembered the sound. Fear was a shared experience, and shared experiences shaped identity. In Tudor England, fear wasn't an accident. It was a system. Justice wasn't just law. It was theatre, and every subject was in the audience. In Tudor England, poverty wasn't viewed as a hardship. It was treated as a malfunction. Being poor wasn't tragic. It was illegal. Instead of receiving sympathy, the poor found themselves entangled in a system that managed them with the enthusiasm of someone sweeping a mess they hoped no one would notice. The Crown didn't look at the poor and see citizens in need. It saw potential disorder, idle hands and wandering bodies that threatened the carefully structured hierarchy it worked so hard to maintain. The poor laws existed to regulate poverty, not alleviate it. These laws didn't ask why someone was poor. They asked how quickly the issue could be contained. Local parishes were required to keep track of their poor, identifying who belonged to the community and who didn't. This distinction was essential. If you were a local poor person, your parish grudgingly acknowledged responsibility for you. If you were from anywhere else, you were a problem to be removed immediately. Poverty was a local burden, and communities guarded their resources with sharp eyes and even sharper suspicions. At the centre of these laws was the fear of vagrancy. A vagrant wasn't someone enjoying a pleasant walk between towns. They were anyone travelling without clear purpose, employment, or permission. Vagrancy laws weren't concerned with compassion. They were concerned with preventing movement. A wandering person was unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous. Wandering suggested idleness, and idleness suggested moral weakness, and moral weakness suggested potential rebellion. In a society obsessed with order, a person who didn't stay put was a threat. Authorities responded with measures that treated movement almost like a crime. If you were caught roaming without reason, you could be whipped, branded, or forced back to your birthplace. Branding marked you permanently, turning your skin into a legal document declaring you untrustworthy. The punishment didn't rehabilitate anyone. It simply announced to the world that you had stepped out of line. The logic was simple. Fear kept people still, and still people caused fewer problems. The Crown framed forced labour as the solution to poverty. If you were poor, you were expected to work, immediately, consistently, and under supervision. Work was treated as both cure and punishment. Officials believed the poor were idle, a word that encompassed everything from unemployment to exhaustion. If you weren't actively producing, you were suspicious, and suspicion justified coercion. Workhouses and compulsory labour schemes existed not to empower the poor, but to discipline them. These institutions were places where poverty was scrubbed away through toil, as if hard work alone could erase social inequality. Parishes assigned the poor to tasks deemed appropriate for their condition. Some were contracted out to local landowners for field labour. Others were handed domestic work, street cleaning, or other tasks no one else wanted to do. Children especially became targets for forced apprenticeships, placed with masters who were expected to turn them into productive adults. These apprenticeships weren't always chosen. They were often a matter of compulsion. A child's future wasn't planned by aspiration. It was allocated by necessity. The system made a clear distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor. The deserving poor were people whose poverty had an acceptable cause: age, illness, disability. They were allowed pity, though only carefully measured amounts. The undeserving poor were everyone else: the unemployed, the wandering, the unlucky. Their poverty was interpreted as laziness or corruption, and they were punished accordingly. This moral division allowed society to maintain sympathy without disrupting the larger belief that poverty was a personal failure. Communities enforced these laws with the same vigilance they applied to religious conformity or household order. People watched for signs of poverty the way others watched for signs of illness or misbehaviour. A neighbour who seemed suddenly short of food, clothing or stability became the subject of whispered concern, not because people wanted to help, but because they worried the parish might be forced to support someone who couldn't support themselves. Compassion existed, but it had to compete with fear of economic burden. The Crown reinforced these attitudes by structuring local taxation around poor relief. Parishes collected money to support their poor, and no one wanted that burden increased. As a result, communities restricted who they allowed to settle, who they recognised as genuine residents, and who they pushed out swiftly. Belonging to a parish wasn't a matter of residency, it was a matter of eligibility. If you couldn't prove your roots, you were encouraged, sometimes forcibly, to find another parish that claimed you. Punishments for violating vagrancy laws were intentionally spectacular. Whipping wasn't a private rebuke. It was performed publicly to remind everyone that wandering too far or failing to work had consequences. Officials wanted the poor to fear poverty as much as punishment, creating a cycle where people clung tightly to their homes, their communities, and whatever work they could find, no matter how meagre. But beneath this harshness was a deeper truth. Tudor society depended on the poor even as it punished them. The labour economy couldn't function without them. The fields couldn't be tended, the cities couldn't be maintained. Their work sustained the kingdom, even as their condition made authorities uneasy. The poor were indispensable, and yet treated as if their existence needed constant justification. Poverty in this world wasn't an unfortunate circumstance. It was a category people were pushed into, monitored in, and punished for inhabiting. The system didn't try to solve poverty. It tried to control it, contain it, and make it predictable. The poor were managed, not helped. Because helping them would have required acknowledging that the structure of society created poverty in the first place, and no Tudor official wanted to admit that. In Tudor England, the idea of simply packing a bag, stepping outside your village, and seeing where the road took you belonged to the realm of reckless fantasy. Freedom stopped at the village edge. You didn't go on a trip. You filed a personality report. Movement wasn't independence. It was an act that demanded justification, supervision, and often paperwork. In a world built on stability and predictability, a person who wandered was unsettling. A person who wandered without permission was practically declaring they had suspicious intentions. Most people lived and died within a small radius of their birthplace, not because they lacked curiosity, but because travel was a regulated act. Leaving your parish meant entering someone else's, and every parish guarded its boundaries as jealously as a wary cat guarding its favourite chair. Outsiders were unpredictable variables in a carefully balanced system. They might carry disease, gossip, criminal intent, or, perhaps most alarming of all, needs. If a stranger required support, food, or shelter, the local community might be forced to provide it. Nobody wanted that. To travel legally, you needed a pass, an official piece of documentation that explained who you were, where you were going, why you were going there, and essentially whether anyone should trust you. Passes served as both identification and warning labels. They told local authorities you weren't a vagrant, weren't avoiding work, and weren't wandering aimlessly. They were small pieces of parchment that acted like portable reputations, and without one, you were in trouble. Being caught on the road without permission meant you looked exactly like the kind of person vagrancy laws were written to punish. To officials, you were a puzzle piece in the wrong box. Suspicion trailed you like a loyal dog. Constables might detain you, question you, or escort you back to your place of origin. If they doubted your story, or if you didn't have one, they could whip you, fine you, or classify you as a vagrant. The road wasn't freedom. It was a legal obstacle course. Even with a pass, movement wasn't exactly carefree. Villagers scrutinized newcomers intensely. People watched strangers the way they watched approaching storms. Not necessarily dangerous, but definitely capable of ruining the day. Local gossip networks activated instantly. Who is he? Where did she come from? Why are they here? Answers didn't soothe concerns. They simply offered new ones. A stranger's arrival was an event the whole village attended to, even if only from behind half-open shutters. Inns kept records of travellers, both to manage their businesses and because officials expected them to. Hosting a stranger without asking questions was risky. Innkeepers could be fined for harbouring suspicious persons. If a traveller didn't have a pass, didn't have money, or didn't have a believable story, their stay could quickly become much shorter than expected, especially if a sheriff wandered by. The Crown's deep mistrust of movement didn't come from paranoia alone. Mobility disrupted the system. Taxes were local, labour was local, poor relief was local, duties, responsibilities, and surveillance were local. When someone moved, all these elements became complicated. A stranger lacked context, background, and accountability. A village couldn't easily tell if they were safe, obedient, honest, or capable of causing trouble. Control required predictability, and travellers were anything but predictable. Roads themselves reinforced this anxiety. They were rough, poorly marked, and filled with uncertainties. Travellers faced risks from bandits, wild animals, or simply getting lost. But even these dangers paled in comparison to the social danger of being stopped by officials who thought you didn't belong where you were. The roads weren't empty. They were patrolled by suspicion. Merchants were among the few who travelled frequently, but even they relied on licenses, guild documents, and letters of introduction. Their livelihoods depended on being recognisable as legitimate wanderers. Without proper documentation, a merchant with a cart full of goods looked dangerously similar to someone fleeing a crime scene with stolen property. Appearances mattered, and so did paperwork. Pilgrims, once common travellers in earlier times, faced new challenges after religious reforms. Their journeys were scrutinised more intensely, their purposes questioned, their routes watched. Travel for spiritual reasons had once been considered virtuous. Now officials worried that wandering pilgrims resembled vagrants too closely. If a religious traveller didn't articulate a clear, crown-approved reason for their movement, they invited unwanted attention. Even seasonal movement, like labourers seeking harvest work, required negotiation. Landowners often sought outside workers, but parish officials didn't like the idea of temporary residents who might become permanent burdens. Agreements were made cautiously. A labourer might be allowed in, but only briefly, and always under supervision. If they overstayed, suddenly their welcome expired, and they faced the familiar accusation of idleness. Travel was never simply travel. It was identity on the move. It was scrutiny on wheels. A traveller had to justify themselves at every turn, why they were on the road, where they were headed, and whether they were the kind of person who should be allowed to move freely. The freedom of wandering became the privilege of the documented, the trusted, the predictable. Everyone else stayed home. Most people didn't mind. Or rather, they learned not to mind. When travel is dangerous, complicated, and suspicious, staying put feels safe. The village became not just home, but universe. Leaving it became an act of courage, necessity, or desperation. For many, walking past the boundary felt like stepping off a cliff. Movement was not a right. It was a negotiation with authority, a balancing act between necessity and suspicion. The Crown didn't need to ban travel outright. It only needed to make it difficult enough that people rarely attempted it. Freedom travelled slowly in Tudor England. People did not. Markets in Tudor England were not carefree places of commerce where you wandered freely, haggled loudly, and bought whatever caught your eye. They were political arenas, regulated, monitored, and infused with the crown's presence at every stall. Buying bread meant trusting the crown, because even your bread was government approved. Markets weren't just places where goods changed hands. They were places where authority made itself felt in every price tag, every transaction, and every bite. The crown understood something fundamental: control the market, and you control the mood of the people. Food shortages, inflated prices, or dishonest sellers could spark unrest faster than any sermon or proclamation could soothe it. A hungry population was unpredictable. A fed population, well, they were easier to manage. So the crown inserted itself into the marketplace like a stern supervisor who definitely wasn't buying anything but still felt entitled to rearrange everything on the shelves. Price controls became one of the main tools for managing daily life. Officials set assize prices for staple goods, especially bread, ale, and grain. Bakers couldn't simply decide what their loaves were worth. The government told them. A loaf of bread was tied directly to the price of grain, and grain was tied directly to what the crown believed was fair, or more accurately, what it believed would prevent riots. Bakers were expected to follow these regulations down to the ounce. Too small a loaf or too high a price wasn't just poor business. It was a punishable offence, treated with a seriousness usually reserved for crimes that involved actual victims. Alehouse owners faced similar rules. The price of a drink wasn't determined by taste or quality, but by what local authorities declared acceptable. Alehouses were monitored closely, not because authorities cared about flavour, but because they cared about gatherings. Too many people drinking too cheaply created crowds with opinions, and an opinionated crowd was dangerous. But price controls weren't the only layer of regulation. Markets operated under a complex system of monopolies, exclusive rights granted by the crown to specific merchants, industries, or companies. These monopolies didn't encourage competition, they eliminated it. A monopoly was a royal blessing that allowed someone to control a particular trade, often raising prices with an enthusiasm that came from knowing no one else was allowed to sell the same thing. The crown loved monopolies because they brought in revenue. The public hated monopolies because they brought in headaches. Yet complaining about them was risky. Criticising a monopoly wasn't just criticising a merchant, it was criticising the crown's judgment. And that was a dangerous hobby. Royal licences added another layer of control. Want to sell in the market? You needed permission. Want to run a stall? Permission. Want to trade a certain item? Permission again. A licence wasn't just paperwork. It was proof that you operated under royal authority. The crown treated markets like extensions of its own household, deciding who had the right to profit and who didn't. Without a licence, a merchant was a nobody, and being a nobody in a marketplace full of royal oversight was a good way to get fined, shut down, or accused of illicit trading. Market inspectors, or searchers, patrolled stalls with the energy of people who enjoyed their jobs too much. They examined weights, tested measures, and checked the quality of goods. A dishonest scale could bring punishment. Selling spoiled food could bring worse. Even the size of a loaf or the measure of ale could result in penalties. Merchants lived under constant scrutiny, partly because the crown insisted on fairness, and partly because fairness helped keep the peace. The political nature of markets also appeared in how communities responded to scarcity. When grain supplies dropped or prices rose, authorities intervened quickly. They raided hoards, confiscated stockpiles, and forced merchants to sell at controlled prices. Not because they were particularly benevolent, but because famine led directly to panic, and panic led directly to unrest. Stability mattered more than profit, and markets became battlegrounds where the crown fought to keep the public calm. For ordinary people, the market was where politics became personal. Every purchase embodied a set of rules they never voted on but always felt. Buying bread wasn't just an economic act, it was a display of how well the system functioned. A full market signalled stability, an empty one signalled danger. People learned to read these signs instinctively. A butcher's stall with limited meat hinted at bad harvests. A baker increasing his prices hinted at grain shortages. A merchant unable to secure a license hinted at shifting power dynamics. Trust in the crown was baked, quite literally, into daily life. You ate what the crown allowed, bought what the crown approved, and lived with prices the crown calculated. Even the rhythm of market days followed royal charters. A town didn't simply decide when to host a market. It required royal permission to hold one. The crown essentially said, "Yes, you may gather, but only with our blessing," and towns obeyed. Yeah, because markets kept communities alive. But beneath the surface of this structured environment was a constant undercurrent of negotiation. Merchants tried to stretch rules without breaking them. Customers tried to find bargains without raising suspicions. Inspectors tried to enforce regulations without appearing tyrannical. Everyone operated within a system that demanded obedience while encouraging quiet bending. Despite the tension, markets thrived. They were essential, places where life happened, where news spread, where communities interacted, and where the crown's authority became visible in the most mundane transactions. Markets were the pulse of the town, beating in rhythm with royal decisions, local concerns, and the unpredictability of seasons. In Tudor England, the market wasn't simply where you bought food. It was where you learned, daily, who truly ran the kingdom. Work in Tudor England wasn't an open field where you wandered freely until you discovered your passion. It was more like a hallway lined with locked doors, and only one of them was cracked open for you. You didn't choose a career, the town chose for you. Occupation wasn't merely a job, it was an identity assigned, regulated, monitored, and preserved by guilds that treated every craft like a fragile inheritance that needed constant supervision. Guilds were the great occupational gatekeepers of Tudor society. Each town had its own collection of craft guilds, powerful organisations that controlled who worked, how they worked, what they produced, and how much they could charge for their work. Guilds didn't just manage trades, they managed people. They turned occupation into a lineage, a community, and sometimes a prison. Once you entered a craft, you didn't simply participate in it, you became defined by it. Your introduction to guild life usually began early. If your father was a blacksmith, chances were high you'd end up pounding iron too. If your father brewed ale, the smell of malt would cling to your childhood the way responsibilities cling to adulthood. For many families, the choice wasn't romantic or nostalgic, it was practical. Joining the family's trade meant access to tools, connections, and a master who wouldn't beat you too harshly for early mistakes. Practicality always won. Apprenticeships were the gateway. Boys, sometimes girls in certain crafts, were bound by contract to a master for 7 years or more. During that time, the apprentice lived in the master's household, learning skills by repetition, discipline, and the occasional blister. Apprentices were fed, clothed, and trained, but not paid. Their wages came later, if they survived the training, the monotony, and the expectation that loyalty mattered as much as talent. Apprenticeship wasn't just instruction, it was indoctrination into the rules, rituals, and hierarchy of the guild. Those 7 years shaped the future. When an apprentice completed their training, they became a journeyman, allowed to work for wages but not to open their own workshop. That required mastery, proving skill, paying dues, and producing a masterpiece judged by the guild's elders. The masterpiece wasn't merely about craftsmanship, it was about respect, conformity, and demonstrating that you understood the guild's traditions. Creativity was an option. Compliance was mandatory. Once accepted, with full membership in a guild meant more than the right to work. It granted access to a tightly controlled occupational world where guild members set standards, resolved disputes, monitored quality, and enforced rules. Each craft had expectations: how leather should be cut, how bread should be shaped, how wool should be spun, how shoes should be stitched. Deviations weren't charming, they were punishable. A shoemaker who produced shoddy work didn't just disappoint customers, He threatened the guild's reputation and the stability of prices. Standards protected everyone, except people who wanted to innovate. Guild meetings reinforced this structure. Members gathered to discuss rules, elect officers, allocate apprenticeships, and maintain the trade's dignity. These meetings were part parliament, part family reunion, part disciplinary hearing. Decisions affected entire neighbourhoods. A new regulation about cloth quality could shift markets. A ruling about who could open a shop could determine whether a young journeyman advanced or stagnated. Guild halls weren't simply administrative spaces, they were nerve centres of local power. Work became identity because guilds made it so. Bakers were bakers, not people who happened to bake. Coopers lived as coopers. Carpenters belonged to a tradition stretching back generations. The guild system folded occupation into selfhood until the two were indistinguishable. A person's craft determined their social circle, their reputation, their marriage prospects, and their standing in the community. To lose one's trade wasn't just unemployment, it was personal dissolution. And because guilds guarded their privileges fiercely, they limited outside competition. Want to start a craft in a new town? Not without permission. Want to switch trades? Nearly impossible. Want to innovate? That suspicious behaviour might get you punished, fined, or sidestepped. Guilds protected their members from external threats, but they also protected themselves from internal disruption. Stability trumped creativity. Tradition trumped individuality. The guild existed to prevent chaos, not to encourage dreams. Monopolies intersected with guild life in complicated ways. A royal monopoly could disrupt an entire trade by giving exclusive rights to one individual or company. When this happened, guild members protested furiously, not out of love for the crown, but out of fear that their livelihoods were being undermined. But even in resistance, the guild followed procedure. Protests weren't spontaneous. They were structured, petitioned, and carefully worded to avoid offending the monarchy, while still begging it to reconsider. Guild regulation also shaped gender roles. Women participated in certain trades, brewing, textile work, midwifery, but their access was often mediated through male relatives. A widow could inherit her husband's workshop, but she remained bound by guild expectations. Women's labour was essential, but often unofficial, slipping through the cracks of rules written by and for men. Even when women excelled at their crafts, the guild system kept them at the margins. Despite the strictness, guilds provided security. Members supported one another in sickness, death, or hardship. They offered burial funds, legal representation, and social networks. A guild wasn't just a regulatory body, it was a safety net. But like all safety nets, it came with ropes that tied you down. The guild system kept order in a world that feared instability. It assigned roles, preserved quality, protected markets, and ensured that trades didn't collapse under chaos or competition. It also confined people, narrowed possibilities, and turned occupation into destiny. Work wasn't simply what you did, it was who you had to be. In Tudor England, guilds kept people in line not through oppression alone, but through expectation, tradition, and community pressure. You didn't choose your path. You walked the one laid for you, step by regulated step. Festivals in Tudor England looked joyful on the surface. Bright colours, noisy crowds, music, feasting, dancing. The kind of energy that made everyday life feel briefly lighter. But beneath the merriment was a structure as rigid as any law. Fun was regulated. You could party, just not creatively. Every celebration existed in the narrow space between permitted delight and dangerous independence. Festivals were controlled chaos, choreographed carefully enough to satisfy the need for release, while preventing anyone from getting ideas above their station. The Crown approved certain celebrations because they served a purpose. Major feast days, seasonal festivals, and communal gatherings helped maintain social cohesion. They gave people something to look forward to, a sanctioned break from the grind of work and obligation. A festival allowed tension to leak out of a community before it turned into unrest. but the Crown never forgot that crowds were unpredictable, and unpredictability was a threat. A celebration could transform into a protest with alarming speed, and so the state managed festivals the way it managed everything else, with oversight, rules, and an ever-watchful eye. Some festivals were encouraged because they reinforced the social order. Harvest celebrations reminded people of their dependence on landowners. May Day festivities emphasized fertility, renewal, and the importance of stable seasons, stability being the Crown's favourite concept. Christmas feasts provided an opportunity for nobles and wealthy townspeople to demonstrate generosity to the poor, reaffirming their authority and magnanimity in one elegant gesture. Even dancing in its own way helped reinforce hierarchy. Certain dances belonged to the elite, or others to common folk, and both groups knew better than to cross the floor into the other's territory. Other customs, however, were banned, regulated, or quietly discouraged. Any tradition that blurred class lines, mocked authority, or involved ritualized misbehavior made officials nervous. Plays and mummers' performances came under suspicion because actors could slip in jokes that cut too close to political reality. Carnival-like misrule, where servants briefly took on the roles of masters, risked making people too comfortable with the fantasy. Crowds grew rowdy, masks hid identities, and the line between harmless revelry and provocative behaviour tightened dangerously. The state wasn't alone in monitoring these events. Local authorities played their part with gusto. Church wardens and constables attended festivals partly to enjoy them, but mostly to ensure no one enjoyed them too much. They watched for excessive drinking, indecent behaviour, fights, and political speech disguised as entertainment. They kept an eye on who gathered with whom. Festivals were as much about people-watching as they were about celebrating. To maintain order, authorities imposed rules on everything from the size of gatherings to the hours they were allowed. A festival could start with laughter in the afternoon and end abruptly when the bell signalled curfew. No one questioned it. The community had internalized the idea that festivities were temporary privileges, not rights. When the official end came, people dispersed quickly, not wanting to provoke suspicion by lingering too long. The Crown also manipulated festivals as opportunities for messaging. Royal celebrations, coronations, weddings, our births, victories, were transformed into national spectacles. These events travelled outward from the court through proclamations, performances, and public displays designed to inspire loyalty. Villages held feasts, drank to the royal health, and decorated their squares in ways that visually affirmed their connection to the monarchy. Even joy became political. At times, the Crown used festivals to assert control more aggressively. When tensions rose, the monarchy cancelled celebrations, banned gatherings, or replaced local traditions with standardised ones that were easier to monitor. Too much spontaneous energy could be dangerous. A festival without oversight was a gathering. A gathering was a crowd, and a crowd was something Tudor authorities instinctively distrusted. But while festivals were regulated, they weren't joyless. Our people embraced the space they were given and squeezed as much happiness into it as they could. Dancing, singing, drinking, storytelling. These moments offered a reprieve from the weariness of daily life. Even regulated fun was still fun. People sang loudly enough to forget their worries, drank enough to dull their aches, and celebrated enough to remember they were human. Creativity lived on in the margins. Musicians improvised under the watchful eyes of officials. Dancers added flourishes to steps that were technically allowed. Storytellers inserted mild jokes about local life, carefully avoiding anything that sounded like criticism of authority. The rules were there, but so was the human urge to play. Some traditions slipped through the cracks. Old customs survived in households, in whispers, or in small corners of festivals where the watchful gaze drifted elsewhere. People clung to the rituals that defined their communities, even as the Crown attempted to standardise or reshape them. Festivals became battlegrounds of identity, where official regulations collided with older, deeper cultural rhythms. One of the most fascinating parts of Tudor festival culture was this constant negotiation between structure and spontaneity. The crown wanted predictability. The people wanted joy. The resulting compromise was a carefully balanced system where celebrations could be lively, but never rebellious, communal, but never chaotic, joyful, but never provocative. In this environment, people learned to enjoy themselves quietly, loudly, to dance energetically within acceptable steps, to laugh fully but at the right jokes, to celebrate the season while remembering who allowed them to celebrate in the first place. Festivals were the kingdom taking a deep breath, but always under supervision. In Tudor England, the law didn't pretend to be a guardian of moral truth, or a philosophical guide to right and wrong. It had one priority: order. Stability mattered more than fairness. The law didn't care if it was right, it cared if it worked. Crime was defined less by the nature of the offence, and more by whether the act threatened the kingdom's fragile balance. Justice wasn't blind. It had perfect eyesight, saw exactly what it wanted to see, and ignored everything else. The Tudor legal system viewed society like a precarious stack of wooden blocks. Anything that might jiggle the tower, poverty, movement, disorder, disobedience, scandal, needed immediate correction. The goal wasn't to judge morality, but to prevent collapse. A crime was anything that disrupted the arrangement. If that meant punishing petty theft harshly, while overlooking violent disputes among the powerful, so be it. Consistency wasn't the point. Control was. For common people, the idea of fairness had little place in their experience of justice. Courts focused on maintaining peace, obedience, and predictability. If an action caused tension in the community, endangered someone's reputation, or hinted at future trouble, the law stepped in. Sometimes it acted swiftly, sometimes selectively, and almost always with an eye toward preventing problems, not just punishing them. The legal system believed deeply in the idea that one bad apple could spoil not just the barrel, but the entire orchard. This philosophy led to laws that prioritized visibility. Offences weren't judged solely on harm, they were judged on the signal they sent. You could steal something privately and face moderate punishment. But if your theft suggested instability, if it caused a stir, if it revealed resentment, if it inspired others, then penalties intensified. Public order mattered more than the details. It wasn't the loaf of bread that posed danger. It was the possibility that a hungry crowd might follow your example. Moral offences fell into the same category. The state didn't scrutinize behavior because it wanted to uplift souls. It did so because moral chaos suggested social chaos. Acts like adultery, scolding, or drunkenness weren't punished purely for being wrong. They were punished because they disrupted households, reputations, or public peace. A drunk who stumbled home singing loudly wasn't judged immoral, he was judged noisy. Noise meant disorder. Disorder meant danger. Local courts acted as managers, not philosophers. Justices of the peace handled disputes with broad discretion, guided by the principle that peace was more important than precedent. Two people arguing loudly in the street could be fined, not because arguing was inherently criminal, but because arguments invited escalation. A household that looked chaotic could be investigated, not because officials cared about emotional harmony, but because disorder inside could become disorder outside. The law intervened anywhere tension threatened to spill over its boundaries. This system produced punishments that reflected the need for public reassurance. Fines, shaming, stocks, and other penalties weren't simply acts of discipline, they were acts of display. The community needed to see justice functioning, reminding everyone that the Crown was watching and that disruption never went unanswered. The goal wasn't rehabilitation, it was demonstration. Disputes between neighbours were treated with particular seriousness. A feud could turn into violence, violence into faction, faction into rebellion. The legal system stepped in early, issuing warnings, demanding apologies, or imposing fines to prevent escalation. If two families couldn't stop arguing over a fence, Tudor officials treated it as a miniature crisis, not because they cared about the fence, but because they cared about the potential ripple effect. Every conflict had the potential to grow, and the crown didn't like growth unless it involved crops or taxes. Or even more telling was how justice treated the powerful. A noble could get away with behaviours that would have ruined a commoner, not because the law admired wealth, but because punishing the powerful could destabilise the social hierarchy. Order depended on keeping elites in place. If punishing them created political ripples, the system backed down. Fairness bowed to stability every time. The legal machinery operated like a well-trained servant, effective when needed, invisible when inconvenient. Intent mattered far less than effect. If your action caused trouble, you were responsible for the trouble, regardless of your motives. A careless comment could become a seditious statement. A misunderstanding could become a scandal. A mistake could become a crime. The law didn't investigate internal feelings. It judged outward consequences. Keeping peace was the ultimate metric. Property law followed the same logic. Theft wasn't just stealing, it was undermining trust. Damaging crops wasn't just destructive, it threatened food security. Poaching wasn't just illegal, it challenged the rights of landowners and the structure of privilege itself. Every offence had a symbolic weight far heavier than the act itself. In some ways, this approach made the legal system brutally efficient. Everyone understood the expectations. You didn't need to memorize the law. You needed to understand the philosophy behind it. Don't cause trouble. Don't attract attention. Don't disrupt anything. Obedience was practical, not virtuous. Yet efficiency came at the cost of fairness. People knew the law wasn't designed for justice. It was designed for containment, and so they adapted. They settled disputes privately whenever possible. They avoided unnecessary noise. They learned how to apologize strategically. They stayed out of trouble not because they were morally pure, but because the consequences of disorder were too severe to risk. In Tudor England, crime was never simply about breaking rules. It was about disturbing the balance. And in a kingdom perpetually worried about that balance tipping, the law functioned less like a judge and more like a tightrope walker. Arms out, eyes forward, doing whatever it took to keep things from falling. For women in Tudor England, authority wasn't a single weight pressing down from above. It was a stack. Crown above, husband below. You answered to the king through your husband. Yeah, every rule that governed society passed through two filters before reaching a woman's daily life. The expectations of the monarchy and the expectations of the household patriarch. And because each system reinforced the other, women lived inside a hierarchy so layered that questioning it felt as impossible as questioning gravity. Legally, women had limited identity independent of men. A woman wasn't a freestanding subject in the eyes of the law. She was attached, first to her father, then to her husband. This attachment wasn't sentimental. It was structural. It shaped where she lived, how she worked, what property she could hold, and how she was judged when disputes arose. The crown set the framework, but husbands executed the daily enforcement. Or a woman's entire world was filtered through the authority of men who themselves answered to a larger system that never asked for her opinion. Marriage sealed this arrangement more tightly. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She couldn't independently sign contracts, sue, own property, or control her wages. Even the clothes she wore technically belonged to him. A wife existed in a legal shadow, recognized, but not quite distinct. Her responsibilities were spelled out clearly. Her rights were carefully limited. The laws didn't imagine her as an autonomous person, because autonomy would have disrupted the neat hierarchy that kept households, and therefore the kingdom, stable. Unmarried women, oddly enough, had slightly more legal room. Widows could own property, run businesses, or manage estates. But their independence was tolerated mainly because they had already fulfilled their expected role. They'd married, served a household, produced heirs, and completed the duties society required. Their independence came not from recognition of equality, but from the absence of a man to oversee them. Even then, widows were watched closely, their decisions scrutinized by male relatives, neighbors, and officials who believed that too much independence could lead to disorder. Gender-shaped expectations from infancy. Girls were trained early in obedience, household tasks, modesty, and silence. Their education, when available, focused on domestic management, basic literacy, and religious instruction. Learning to read was often encouraged so they could consume scripture and moral texts, but writing was deemed unnecessary or even suspicious. Written words left records, and records could be used in ways men found inconvenient. A girl was raised not to pursue opportunity, but to function efficiently inside a system designed by others. Work reflected these constraints. Women laboured in nearly every sector: fields, markets, workshops, kitchens, but their contributions were frequently unacknowledged in official records. The work they did for wages was often lumped under their husband's name. The work they did at home was invisible, yet the entire economy relied heavily on women's labour. Brewing, spinning, childcare, dairying, textile production, washing, tending small livestock, preparing food, running stalls, and assisting in craft shops. Women kept households operational, yet the structure around them insisted on calling them dependents, as if the kingdom would function just as well without their constant, quiet involvement. Morality rules weighed more heavily on women than men. Society expected women to be modest, obedient, patient, and morally pure. Their reputations functioned like fragile glass, once cracked, impossible to repair. A man's misbehaviour could be dismissed as temperament. A woman's misbehaviour became community gossip, moral warning, and sometimes legal trouble. If a household felt unstable, the community frequently assumed the woman lacked control or failed in her duties. Blame climbed up the hierarchy only when forced. Otherwise, it settled comfortably at the level of the wife. Female sexuality, especially, was policed with the intensity of people guarding a national treasure, as marriage determined legitimacy, inheritance, and social order, so women's conduct was treated as a matter of public concern. Anything that hinted at sexual independence threatened the stability of lineage, property, and expectations. This wasn't about virtue, it was about control. Even suspicion could damage a woman's standing. A whispered rumour could alter how neighbours greeted her, how officials treated her, and how her husband viewed her. Her conduct was both private duty and public performance. Religion reinforced these gendered expectations. Sermons reminded women to obey their husbands, keep their households orderly, and avoid anything that smelled of vanity or ambition. Women were praised for submission and chastised for independence. Faith blended with social instruction, merging divine law with domestic obedience until they became indistinguishable. Women heard repeatedly that stability flowed downward, from God to king to husband to household, and if something went wrong at the bottom, the fault was almost always assigned upward, from household chaos to marital failure to moral disorder. Still, women found ways to navigate these limits. Some ran businesses quietly through male relatives, using their names to conduct transactions. Others shaped community life through informal networks, sharing resources, offering support, spreading information. Some acted as healers, midwives, or herbalists, roles that brought influence even without formal authority. A few, especially widows, managed property with skill that earned respect even from those who refused to admit it publicly. New women weren't passive subjects. They were active participants in the life of the kingdom, working within the structure even when they couldn't change it. But the structure remained. Authority pressed from above and below, shaping every aspect of their existence. A woman's relationship with the crown was indirect, filtered through the men who spoke for her, represented her, or controlled her. The laws didn't need to address women directly because the system ensured they were addressed continuously within the household. The crown ruled the country, husbands ruled the home, and women lived in the space between those two forces, navigating a life shaped by expectations they never consented to, but had to master to survive. Double authority wasn't an accident. It was the design. And women learned its contours the way they learned the lines on their hands, intimately, unavoidably, and long before they were old enough to question them. Loyalty in Tudor England wasn't something you simply felt. It was something you performed, and you didn't just obey, you demonstrated it. The crown expected its subjects to show devotion publicly, repeatedly, and unmistakably, as if the stability of the entire kingdom depended on everyone agreeing to rehearse the same ritual every day. In many ways it did. Obedience wasn't private virtue, it was visible proof that you belonged. Every Tudor life was punctuated by moments requiring overt displays of loyalty. Some were grand: oath ceremonies, royal birthdays, coronation feasts. Others were small but constant: gestures of respect, verbal affirmations, the way you stood, the way you addressed authority, even the tone you used when referencing the monarch. These rituals anchored the social order, reminding people not just who ruled them, but how they were expected to feel about that rule, or at least pretend to feel. In Tudor England, sincerity was optional, performance was mandatory. Oaths were the formal backbone of loyalty. When a new monarch rose to the throne, or when laws changed, or when religious reforms required new declarations, subjects swore allegiance. These oaths didn't merely confirm political loyalty, they acted as moral anchors. Once you swore loyalty, you were bound not just legally but spiritually. Failing an oath wasn't just disobedience, it was betrayal. And betrayal was treated with a seriousness that made even the boldest souls reconsider their appetite for risk. Communities often gathered for public oath-taking ceremonies. Parish priests read the required promises aloud, and townspeople followed, repeating the words as a collective body. Standing among neighbours, hearing voices merge into a single chorus, made loyalty feel less like a choice and more like a force of nature. No one wanted to be the person who mouthed the words too softly or hesitated between lines. Hesitation had a way of echoing. Ceremonies weren't limited to oaths. Royal events, births, marriages, victories, holidays were celebrated with prescribed rituals. Bells rang, feasts were held, decorative arches appeared in town squares, people illuminated windows with candles. Every gesture was a reminder that the monarch's joys and sorrows were everyone's business. Even if you weren't personally invested, you were expected to behave as if you were. The crown's triumphs became your triumphs, and the crown's losses became your burdens. Symbolic obedience seeped into everyday gestures. When someone mentioned the monarch in conversation, you removed your hat. When a royal proclamation was read aloud in the square, you stood attentively, even if the wind was icy and you couldn't hear half the words. When passing the lord of your manor, an extension of royal authority, you bowed. The body became a tool for expressing allegiance, heads lowered, hands clasped, posture attentive. The kingdom did not rely solely on laws, it relied on choreography. The physical landscape reflected this culture of performance. Portraits of the monarch hung in public buildings. Royal arms appeared on tavern signs, guild halls, bridges, marketplaces, and even church pulpits. These symbols were not decorative, they were reminders. You lived inside a kingdom of visual loyalty, surrounded by icons that told you who held power. Every crest, every banner, every carved lion or fleur-de-lis whispered the same message: remember who watches. Even behaviour in the home contributed to this performance. Families prayed for the monarch's health. They taught children to speak of the crown with respect. They displayed loyalty publicly through their dress, speech and participation in church, but they reinforced it privately through daily habits. A household that failed to demonstrate loyalty publicly risked becoming the subject of whispers, and whispers travelled quickly to people who didn't appreciate improvisation. Local officials monitored this landscape of obedience. Constables, church wardens, and justices kept mental tallies of who appeared at ceremonies, who participated enthusiastically, who dragged their feet. They weren't looking for genuine devotion, they were looking for cracks. A person who avoided public events too often looked unsteady, like someone whose loyalty needed questioning. Avoidance invited suspicion. Suspicion invited scrutiny, and scrutiny invited consequences. People adapted to this world with the skill of seasoned performers. They learned when to nod, when to bow, when to speak up, when to stay silent. They developed reflexes that made obedience seamless. A good subject wasn't someone who never made mistakes. It was someone who never made them visibly. You didn't have to love the monarchy. You had to look like you did. Festivals of loyalty also served a broader political purpose. In times of uncertainty, war, famine, succession disputes, the crown pushed for extra displays. Authorities organised thanksgivings, processions, or prayer days, reinforcing unity through collective action. When the kingdom teetered on instability, the cure wasn't conversation, it was spectacle. Loyalty, expressed in unison, made people feel like the world still made sense. This system worked because people understood its logic. Visible obedience created safety. Performing loyalty protected you. Public allegiance insulated your household from suspicion. No one wanted to stand out for the wrong reasons. Community pressure ensured compliance, even if private thoughts occasionally drifted into dangerous territory. But thinking was safe, speaking was not, and failing to perform entirely was unthinkable. The psychological impact of this constant performance shaped Tudor identity. Loyalty wasn't simply something expressed during major events. It seeped into posture, habits, tone, and expectations. It became second nature, not because people were naturally obedient, but because obedience became the easiest path through life. Tudor loyalty, in the end, was a kind of social theatre. Everyone had a role, everyone knew their cues, and everyone understood that the play never ended. Information in Tudor England was treated with the same caution one might use when handling fire in a dry-thatched barn. Knowledge wasn't a harmless luxury, it was a risk. Too many books meant too many thoughts, and thoughts, especially the unapproved, unpredictable kind, were exactly what the Crown worked tirelessly to contain. Controlling information wasn't a side project of governance, it was a fundamental requirement for keeping the kingdom stable. Printing had exploded across Europe in the century before the Tudors, but England approached this technology with suspicion wrapped in gratitude. Yes, printed text spread ideas faster than ever before, but spreading ideas was precisely the problem. The Crown loved the efficiency of printing when it came to distributing royal proclamations, religious directives, and approved literature. It loved it far less when the press produced pamphlets, critiques, or anything with the potential to stir thoughts better left unstirred. Knowledge spread quickly, and speed was dangerous. To manage this, the Crown built an intricate web of censorship and regulation around the printing industry. Printers couldn't simply decide what to produce. They needed licenses, official permissions that acted like permanent leashes, and they risked severe consequences if they printed anything deemed inappropriate. Inappropriate was a flexible category, shaped heavily by politics, religion, and the monarch's mood. A printer's livelihood depended on correctly guessing which topics were safe, which were questionable, and which were so dangerous they should never even be whispered in the workshop. Every printed text required approval. Bishops, royal councils, or designated officials reviewed manuscripts before they went to press. If a work drifted too close to theological controversy, political commentary, or anything resembling criticism, the approval vanished like steam, and the printer found themselves in trouble. Our booksellers faced similar constraints. They had to monitor what they stocked, sold, or displayed, careful not to let banned works slip through their fingers. Selling the wrong book wasn't a mistake, it was a chargeable offence. The Crown's censorship wasn't subtle. Banned books were confiscated and burned. Authors could be imprisoned, fined, or executed, depending on the severity of their offence. Printers risked losing their licenses, equipment, or fingers. The message was clear. Ideas were powerful, dangerous, and not to be handled casually. It wasn't the ink that frightened authorities, it was the imagination behind it. literacy itself became a matter of concern. While a growing number of people learned to read, the Crown didn't necessarily celebrate this. Reading expanded thought, and expanded thought expanded risk. Literacy among the common people was tolerated only as far as it supported religious instruction, obedience, and economic functionality. Those who learned to read beyond necessity, who became curious, analytical, or intellectually adventurous, stepped into a realm of danger. Too much learning made a person less manageable. Schools and universities existed, of course, but even they operated under strict ideological boundaries. Scholars were expected to support the state's religious positions, uphold its legal philosophy, and avoid controversy. The curriculum favoured tradition, authority, and classical learning. Philosophy was permitted, but only within approved frameworks. Questioning established truths could lead to academic punishment, or worse, political punishment disguised as academic correction. Religious texts posed the greatest concern. After the English Reformation, the Crown understood acutely how powerful a single book could be. The Bible, once restricted to clergy, became available in English, allowing ordinary people to read it. This newfound access terrified officials. If people read scripture without supervision, they might interpret it incorrectly, or correctly in ways the state did not appreciate. Unauthorized interpretations weren't merely theological disagreements, they were threats to national stability. To counter this, the Crown regulated which versions of the Bible could be printed and who could own them. Priests monitored how congregations used religious texts, and households were watched for signs of unusual reading habits. Informants didn't just listen for dangerous speech, they also watched for dangerous books. A household with too many volumes or with titles no one recognized risked suspicion. Reading wasn't private, it was monitored behavior. Even oral information, rumors, news, gossip, fell under scrutiny. Town criers relayed official announcements in public squares, ensuring that the Crown's version of events reached people before any local interpretations could distort it. Authorities policed news networks carefully, worried that misinformation or unauthorized information could travel faster than they could stop it. A rumor could undermine trust. A story could shift opinion. A whisper could inspire doubt. And doubt was a seed the Crown feared more than any armed rebellion. This environment created a culture of caution around knowledge itself. People learned to consume information selectively, focusing on what was safe, approved, or necessary. Curiosity survived, but it learned to keep its voice down. Readers hid controversial books behind uncontroversial ones. Printers tucked suspicious pamphlets into safe shipments. Ideas travelled covertly, like fugitives wearing disguises. But even amid the caution, people continued reading, writing, and whispering. The human mind, once sparked, was difficult to extinguish. Some individuals sought out forbidden texts deliberately, drawn to the thrill of the forbidden. Others stumbled into controversy accidentally, punished for ideas they barely understood. The Crown managed information with considerable efficiency. Yet information had a way of slipping through cracks, embedding itself quietly in the minds of those who dared to think. Still, for most Tudor subjects, controlled information wasn't an inconvenience. It was simply life. The limits were familiar, the boundaries unquestioned. Knowledge wasn't a right. It was a privilege filtered through layers of approval. The Crown didn't need to monitor every mind. It only needed to determine what those minds were allowed to access. Information, in Tudor England, wasn't just power. It was a regulated substance. In Tudor England, stepping inside your house didn't mean stepping outside the reach of authority. Private life wasn't private. Home wasn't safe. It was inspected. The law trailed you through your front door as faithfully as a shadow, settling into your kitchen, watching your routines, and quietly judging whether your household matched the expectations of the Crown, the Church, and your neighbours, who often behaved like unpaid deputies with excellent hearing. Domestic regulation wasn't an optional layer of life. It was woven into the structure of Tudor society. The Crown didn't need spies peering through windows. It relied on a system where everyone watched everyone else, where community order depended on households behaving correctly. A family wasn't merely a family, it was a legal unit, a small, observable piece of the kingdom whose behaviour reflected either stability or trouble. And trouble in any form was suspicious. Everything inside the home had a standard. Households were expected to function smoothly. Doors secure, fires properly managed, children well behaved, meals prepared with acceptable thrift, servants monitored, and resources handled responsibly. Disorder wasn't interpreted as exhaustion or misfortune. It signalled deeper problems. A messy home hinted at laziness. A loud home suggested conflict. A silent home suggested something wrong behind the walls. Domestic life became a performance where the audience extended far beyond the family itself. Officials had every reason to cross your threshold. Constables entered homes to investigate disturbances. Church wardens inspected households to make sure religious objects weren't neglected or hiding suspicious books. Overseers of the poor examined living conditions when someone requested assistance, checking whether need was genuine, moral behaviour was intact, and the family wasn't secretly hoarding resources. Even health crises brought scrutiny. During outbreaks, homes were searched for signs of illness or poor sanitation, and suspicious conditions resulted in quarantines enforced with unsettling efficiency. Fire regulations alone placed your hearth under surveillance. Open flames were a constant danger in tightly packed towns, and households were expected to manage them responsibly. Leaving flames unattended, letting chimneys clog with soot, or storing flammable materials carelessly wasn't merely clumsy, it was illegal. If a fire broke out, officials investigated with the determination of people who had no patience for preventable disasters. A family responsible for a blaze faced fines, punishment, or exile, depending on the damage. The lesson was clear. Your hearth wasn't just your hearth. It was everyone's problem. Moral policing went even deeper. Community members monitored each other's behaviour with a vigilance that blurred the line between concern and intrusion. Neighbours reported drunkenness, marital disputes, swearing, suspicious guests, late-night arrivals, or any behaviour that suggested a household was out of alignment with expected norms. A wife yelling at her husband could spark reports of disorder. A husband spending too much time at an alehouse could lead to visits from officials. A servant lingering outside too long might trigger rumours of secret sin. The law didn't have to monitor virtue, neighbours did. Sexual and marital behaviour received special scrutiny. Adultery was a community scandal, not a private matter. If someone suspected infidelity, the entire neighbourhood became invested. Officials intervened not because they cared about emotions, but because improper conduct signalled instability and threatened social cohesion. Illegitimate births led to investigations that mapped intimate details of people's lives with astonishing bluntness. Bastardy examinations forced unmarried women to identify fathers publicly, often under intense pressure. Private decisions weren't private, they were swallowed by public process. Even hospitality was regulated. Keeping guests too long, housing people without permission, or allowing travellers to stay without informing authorities made a household look suspicious. Inns and taverns were watched especially closely, but private homes weren't exempt. Taking in lodgers could produce benefits, but it also invited scrutiny. If a household harboured someone who later caused trouble, the blame flowed backward, landing squarely on the heads of the hosts. Generosity, therefore, became a calculated risk. Domestic noise could become legal trouble. Loud arguments, late gatherings, boisterous celebrations, or even spirited singing after curfew attracted attention. A noisy house meant potential conflict. Potential conflict meant potential disorder, and disorder of any kind threatened the fragile balance of Tudor community life. Constables didn't wait for violence. Noise alone was enough for intervention. Household production, like ale brewing, textile work, or food preparation, also fell under regulation. If a family brewed ale for sale, it had to meet strict standards. If they sold goods informally, Local authorities cracked down. Domestic industry wasn't free enterprise. It was monitored, inspected, and taxed. Even the tools you owned could raise questions. And too many pots suggested unlicensed brewing. Too many tools suggested unlicensed craft work. A household could accidentally look entrepreneurial and therefore criminal. But perhaps the most invasive part of Tudor domestic regulation was the expectation of public display of proper living. People arranged their homes to appear orderly and respectable, knowing eyes might linger on whatever showed through windows or open doors. The home became a stage where performance and survival intertwined. Children were taught early to behave when outsiders passed. Wives learned to present calmness and modesty. Husbands learned to appear diligent and sober. Even servants understood that their conduct could reflect well or disastrously on the household. Despite all of this, most people didn't view domestic regulation as tyranny. It was simply life, a shared understanding that private behaviour echoed into public consequences. Home wasn't a sanctuary separate from society. It was a visible unit in the larger machinery of the order, a place where expectations entered uninvited and lingered. In Tudor England, the law didn't stop at the threshold. It stepped inside, made itself comfortable, and watched everything quietly. In Tudor England, difference was not a curiosity to be welcomed. It was a warning sign. Foreigners were suspicious by default. Different wasn't illegal. It was suspicious. And suspicion carried weight in a kingdom that treated stability as a fragile prize constantly under threat. To be an outsider was to walk into a world already prepared to question your presence, your origins, your intentions, and sometimes even your accent. As xenophobia wasn't a fringe attitude, it was a built-in feature of Tudor society. Most people lived their entire lives within the borders of their parish, surrounded by faces they knew, customs they recognised, and rhythms they trusted. Anyone who didn't fit that pattern, anyone whose clothing, language, or mannerisms marked them as from elsewhere, triggered instinctive caution. The unfamiliar wasn't just unusual. It was potentially dangerous because it challenged the known structure that kept communities feeling safe. Local authorities reinforced this mindset. Migration control was not a modern invention. It was an everyday practice in Tudor life. Anyone arriving from another town, let alone another country, had to justify their presence. Why were they here? Who vouched for them? How long did they intend to stay? Officials pressed for answers with the energy of people who saw trouble lurking behind every unfamiliar face. A foreigner without proper documentation or support wasn't simply inconvenient. Their presence was considered a possible breach in local security. Licenses and letters of introduction served as passports of sorts. Without them, newcomers risked being classified as vagrants, regardless of their wealth or profession. A travelling merchant from Flanders, a craftsman from France, or a sailor from Spain all faced scrutiny. Not because they were inherently dangerous, but because they didn't fit neatly into the tidy network of obligations and expectations that defined Tudor life. A person without local ties was unpredictable, and unpredictability made officials nervous. Foreigners often found themselves under watch, not necessarily through formal surveillance, but through the pervasive gaze of the community. Neighbours observed where they went, who they spoke with, what they bought, and how they behaved. Small details took on exaggerated importance. A foreigner who didn't attend church? Suspicious. One who spoke quietly with a neighbour in a language no one understood? Suspicious. One who spent too much time on the road or asked too many questions? Very suspicious. Fear of outsiders wasn't just cultural, it was political. England's relationship with other nations was volatile. Wars, alliances, and shifting religious landscapes meant that a foreigner's presence could spark rumours about espionage or political intrigue. A merchant from a rival nation might be perceived as a spy. A traveller with unusual religious practices might be feared as a heretic. Political tension abroad translated into suspicion at home. Religion intensified the scrutiny. After the Reformation, the kingdom grew even more wary of foreign influence. Catholics from abroad were watched for signs of sedition. Protestants fleeing persecution were cautiously accepted but still monitored. Any deviation in worship, gestures or beliefs could make the community uneasy. A person crossing themselves at the wrong moment, quoting scripture in an unfamiliar way, or praying in a language other than English might become an unintentional object of concern. Even trades and professions didn't escape suspicion. Foreign artisans brought skills that locals sometimes admired but often resented. A skilled weaver or goldsmith from overseas could be welcomed for their expertise, yet simultaneously feared for the threat they posed to local guild monopolies. Economic tension quickly turned into cultural tension. A foreign craftsman wasn't just a competitor, he was an outsider disrupting the delicate balance of privilege and opportunity that guilds guarded closely. Identity became a negotiation. Some foreigners assimilated intentionally, adopting English customs, language patterns and religious practices to ease suspicion. Others maintained their traditions quietly, hoping not to attract attention. But even assimilation had limits. A person could mimic English behaviour flawlessly and still be recognised as not one of us. Accent, clothing, or even gestures gave them away. Difference lingered stubbornly. Despite these challenges, foreign communities did exist in Tudor England, particularly in ports, border regions, and certain towns. Dutch and Flemish immigrants contributed to cloth industries. Italian merchants brought luxury goods, and French artisans introduced new techniques. But these communities often lived in tight clusters, partly for safety, and partly because their presence was easier to monitor when they stayed together. They were welcomed for their economic contributions, yet never fully embraced. Suspicion didn't always translate into hostility, but it created a perpetual barrier. A foreign family could live in a town for years and still be considered newcomers. Their children might grow up speaking English perfectly, yet never be entirely free from the subtle, constant feeling of being watched. Belonging was earned through time, behaviour, and conformity, but difference always lingered at the edge of acceptance. Even the Crown, while pragmatic, reinforced these attitudes. Foreigners were useful when they brought wealth or expertise, but they were regulated when they threatened the order of things. Royal policies fluctuated with the political climate, sometimes welcoming migrants, sometimes expelling them. What remained constant was the belief that outsiders required management. Difference was valuable only when it served the state. For the average Tudor subject, fear of foreigners was less ideological than practical. It stemmed from a worldview built on predictable relationships, stable routines, and known boundaries. A stranger, especially a foreign one, introduced variables. Variables introduced risk, and Tudor England had no patience for risk. Foreigners lived in the kingdom, but rarely within its comfort. They were tolerated, used, monitored, and sometimes appreciated, but never taken for granted. To be different in Tudor England wasn't a crime. It was a condition that demanded explanation. Obedience in Tudor England wasn't maintained by constant threats or heavy-handed enforcement. It survived because over time people stopped noticing it. Control worked best when unnoticed. You stopped resisting because it felt normal. What began as a system of rules, expectations and surveillance gradually settled into the bones of daily life, turning obedience into reflex rather than calculation. The Crown didn't need to hover over every parish when the people themselves carried the mechanisms of control inside their minds. Children grew up surrounded by rituals of obedience, curfews, church attendance, deference to elders, caution in speaking, modesty in behaviour, suspicion of outsiders, and rigid expectations of work. None of this felt extraordinary to them. It was simply the structure of life. By the time they reached adulthood, they had internalized the idea that questioning the system was not only dangerous but strange. A person who challenged authority didn't look bold, they looked unhinged. If you wondered why something was forbidden, the answer lay not in logic but in familiarity, because it always had been. This normalization made the Crown's power incredibly efficient. The state didn't need legions of enforcers when the population had already absorbed the message. People avoided risk instinctively. A merchant thinking about raising prices beyond the permitted margin didn't need to be threatened. He imagined the inspector's frown and stopped himself. A woman thinking about hosting an unapproved guest understood the gossip that would follow and reconsidered. A servant tempted to wander without permission remembered the fate of travellers labelled vagrants and chose to stay put. Fear wasn't the engine anymore. Habit was. Even the presence of authority became internal. The parish priest, the constable, the justice of the peace, all represented the crown but only occasionally appeared. Their authority didn't weaken in their absence. The idea of them existed constantly, shaping decisions even when they were miles away. People learned to view their own choices through the imagined eyes of authority, a kind of internal censor that made rebellion feel like bad manners rather than resistance. When the mind pleases itself, the law barely needs to lift a finger. This psychological shift was subtle but powerful. Instead of asking, "Why must I do this?" people asked, "What will happen if I don't?" And the answers were rarely dramatic. You might not be executed or imprisoned, you might simply attract attention. And in Tudor England, attention was often worse than punishment. Being noticed meant being questioned. Being questioned meant being remembered. And being remembered meant being vulnerable. The safest life was the quiet life, the predictable life, the obedient life. Communities reinforced this mindset relentlessly. Social norms functioned as invisible fences. Keeping people inside expected behaviour without requiring direct intervention. If someone stood out, neighbours corrected them swiftly, not always with formal accusations, but with silences, looks, rumours, or subtle pressure. A man who spoke too freely was warned by friends. A woman who dressed too boldly received whispered advice. A youth who questioned authority was nudged back into line. Correction came not from the crown, but from the people who feared what nonconformity might bring to the neighbourhood. These communal pressures created an environment where obedience was a shared performance. Everyone played their part not only for their own safety, but for the safety of the group. Individual behaviour reflected on the entire community, and communities knew that scrutiny often spread outward from a single spark. A household that broke rules risked attracting officials who might pry into others' affairs. A person who behaved oddly risked casting suspicion on their neighbours. Order became a group project, and no one wanted to be the weak link. Religion reinforced this psychological structure. Sermons emphasised obedience, humility, modesty, and acceptance. The pulpit became a place where spiritual doctrine blended seamlessly with social regulation. God's order and the king's order overlapped so thoroughly that questioning one felt like questioning both. A faithful subject was a loyal Christian, and a loyal Christian was a faithful subject. When authority aligns itself with divine will, disobedience becomes not only dangerous but sinful. Over time, subjects learn to interpret rules not as impositions but as necessary anchors in a turbulent world. Life was uncertain. Harvests failed, diseases struck, wars erupted, and fortunes vanished without warning. In such a landscape, stability became precious. The Crown's rules provided structure, predictability, a sense that someone, somewhere, had a plan. Obedience wasn't simply required, it was comforting. The system worked because it gave people something solid to hold on to in a world with few guarantees. Even small freedoms became framed by this mindset. People enjoyed festivals, leisure, work, and family life, but always within boundaries that felt natural to them. When boundaries feel natural, breaking them feels unnatural. A subject might not even realise they were censoring themselves, avoiding questions, or accepting constraints. They simply lived the way they had always lived. Obedience had slipped beneath the surface. This subtle transformation produced a population that didn't merely follow rules, they preemptively avoided breaking them. A kind of anticipatory obedience emerged, where people shaped their choices based on what they believed the Crown would want, not what it explicitly required. The Crown didn't need to regulate every action. Subjects regulated themselves. That was the genius of Tudor control. It became invisible. When authority becomes habit, resistance feels like error. When obedience becomes instinct, freedom becomes a foreign idea. People didn't wake each morning thinking about the crown's power. They simply woke thinking about how to live safely, quietly, properly. And in that mindset, obedience wasn't a burden. It was a normal day. The good news? You survived Tudor England. The bad news? You did it by learning when to stay quiet. Reaching the end of a Tudor lifetime meant more than simply avoiding disease, famine, or misfortune. It meant successfully navigating a world built on layers of authority, subtle expectations, and the quiet understanding that freedom was a pleasant dream best not mentioned aloud. Stability was the crown's great promise, but it came wrapped in a price tag. You could live a long, mostly predictable life under Tudor rule. You just had to master the ancient art of not drawing attention to yourself. Survival wasn't about bravery. It was about calibration. You learned to measure every word, every gesture, every decision against the unwritten rulebook that governed daily existence. You didn't argue with proclamations because proclamations weren't opinions. They were weather, unchangeable and occasionally unpleasant. You didn't question inspections, searches, or gossip because these weren't intrusions. They were the natural acoustics of a world where privacy didn't echo. You learned early that the safest answer to a difficult question was usually a nod. Your home, your workplace, your friendships, your routines, all existed within a net of expectations so finely woven you often didn't realize how closely it held you until you tugged on a thread. Stability required obedience. Obedience required caution, and caution required silence, or at least the appearance of silence. The less noise you made, the less likely you were to be noticed, and the less likely you were to be noticed, the longer your life expectancy became. Freedom wasn't impossible, it was just narrow. You could laugh, celebrate, flirt, work, raise a family, tell stories, attend feasts, and participate in community life with genuine joy. But these pleasures lived inside boundaries. You danced steps someone else choreographed. You celebrated on days the crown approved. You spoke truths that aligned cleanly with official truths. Your life had colour, texture, flavour, but only within the palette the kingdom allowed. The strange thing was how natural it all became. After years of absorbing rules, hearing sermons, witnessing punishments, and watching neighbours adjust their behaviour, you didn't always feel constrained. You felt normal. Normalcy was the most effective form of control Tudor England produced. When the walls are always there, you eventually stopped reaching for the horizon. The crown didn't have to enforce everything. It merely had to enforce enough. The rest happened automatically. Yeah, people who saw a neighbour punished for speaking carelessly learned to speak carefully. People who watched a stranger questioned at the marketplace learned to carry papers. People who witnessed public shaming learned to keep their households tidy. The law didn't need to visit every house. Once the idea of the law lived inside your head, its work was done. You survived by being attentive, by listening more than talking, by echoing the right sentiments, by performing loyalty convincingly, and by not confusing curiosity with courage. You learned when to close your shutters, when to open your door, when to nod politely, when to change the subject, when to leave the room, and when to pretend you didn't hear something that could land you in the stocks. Silence became a skill as essential as farming, weaving, or brewing ale. But this wasn't a joyless life. Far from it. Stability created room for community. The shared warmth of festivals, the gossip traded in the marketplace, the comfort of familiar routines, the pride in craft, the satisfaction of harvest brought in, the relief of long winters survived, and the companionship of neighbours who knew your stories, your family, your laughter. Safety was not freedom, but it was security. And for many people, security mattered more than abstract notions of liberty. Tudor England gave you structure, sometimes crushing, sometimes comforting, always present. Its systems shaped you until your instincts aligned with its expectations. You survived because you adapted, not because you resisted. Resistance was dangerous. Adaptation was practical. The kingdom didn't demand love, it demanded predictability. And you provided it, one careful day at a time. The good news is that you succeeded. You learned to read the room before the room read you. You learned to keep your head down without losing your mind. You learned to blend into the crowd without disappearing completely. You learned to live within boundaries and still carve out moments of joy. The bad news, that skill stayed with you. Once you learned to be careful, it didn't switch off. Even in moments of celebration or laughter, a small part of you remained attuned to the rhythms of rule. Self-preservation became as natural as breathing. Survival in Tudor England wasn't about hiding. It was about harmonizing. You learned the melody of authority and hummed along softly enough not to attract attention, but loudly enough to reassure those around you. You weren't free, but you weren't helpless. You were a subject who understood the balance between safety and silence, and in that balancing act you endured.